Modello, a story of hope for the inner city and beyond. An inside-out model of prevention and resiliency in action. Written by Jack Pransky. Narrated by Risa Ray. Chapter 1. Modello. This is a book about hope, about the triumph of the human spirit, about how all people have something inside them so powerful, so beautiful, so resilient, that once tapped, even some of the most terrible living conditions can be overcome. It is a story of discovery, of profound yet simple truths, of how a new understanding of the human mind changed lives in one of the most violent and dangerous low-income inner-city housing projects in South Florida. What is this understanding? Put simply, it is that everyone has an innate capacity for health and well-being, for wisdom and common sense, and this health, when brought to light, when truly realized, once unleashed, can create the miracle of change. Only one's thinking keeps it hidden, buried, obscured from view, overriding it by making other things appear so real. At first, nearly everyone thought Dr. Roger Mills crazy. How could he bring such ideas into this kind of environment? How could he expect anyone to listen? How could he expect anyone to care? He would be laughed right out of the projects, or worse. Yet 2.5 years later, many lives and destructive conditions had changed. This book is not the place for statistics. Statistics are boring and statistics can mislead, but most all who knew would agree that in the Modello and Homestead Gardens housing projects, violence, delinquency, child abuse and neglect, alcohol and drug abuse, truancy, teenage pregnancy, and welfare dependency decreased markedly. Many residents improved their education and secured jobs. In a nation seeking answers to violence, to crime and drugs, to abuse and poverty, to welfare dependency, to the hopelessness of the inner city and beyond, what took place in the Modello and Homestead Gardens public housing projects cannot be ignored. What happened there has implications for humankind. It all began in a place called Modello. The Modello housing project was someone's idea of model living quarters for poor people. They stuck it out of the way on the outskirts of Miami, a city that seemed to extend forever south down US 1, spilling over its borders into Perrine, Goulds, Naranja, Leisure City, Homestead, into areas not considered part of any official city or town. Modello's dreary beige buildings foretold the mess, the roughness, the tragedy within. Residents feared leaving their units, for shootings had become a way of life, as had the crack, the dealers, the gangs, robberies, beatings, prostitution, the utter despair of it all. We begin with what it was like to live there, in the words of the people who lived it. Lisa. There was lots and lots of crime, a lot of mothers mostly feeling like they were trapped in the situation they were in, including myself. A lot of feelings about your children growing up in this type of environment, because there were drugs galore, people breaking into your houses, fights, women fighting each other like animals out on the street, no one wanting to talk about anything, a lot of problems dealing with the kids. Sicily. Drugs were real bad. Gangs were on every corner. There were shootouts every day. All the kids were running around like there was no school. That's how bad Modello was for about 3 or 4 years. Lisa. It started getting real bad around 78. Then by 83, it was really rough out there. Sicily. People wouldn't even walk out their door. Lisa. When I'd get home, I'd have to run people off of my front porch because they were shooting dice right on my front door. And then they'd start complaining because you'd ask them to leave. I mean, it was bold. It was nothing to be sitting on your front porch with your children and have people drive by with random shootings, and you'd throw the kids in the house because the cops were chasing them or the drug dealers were shooting at each other. It was rough. There was a lot of falling on your knees during that time, dodging bullets. When they started, there wasn't any looking around trying to be nosy. It was hit the ground. Sicily. There were a lot of people that wouldn't come in there, like for pizza delivery. No way they would come in there anymore. Lisa. You couldn't even get a taxi. They said that they were told not to go in there. It had gotten so bad that I actually called the police one time for a friend, and they asked me to meet them out on the street because they didn't even want to come in there. It was so bad that the police didn't even want to come in, and they wanted me to go out of my house. I'm like, are you crazy? You've got the guns in the car, and I'm going to walk out there? It's 10 o'clock at night. I'm not going to walk down on US 1 and flag down a cop. That was how bad it was. Sicily. 2 or 3 times a week at night, people would just go in there robbing, and some got shot in there. I mean, it was really rough. Lisa. Everyone felt such hopelessness. It was depressing. It felt like we were in this world and everyone else was in another world. It was like, this is what my life is going to be. Sicily. Everybody felt like there was nothing we could do. We were just tired. Lisa. We couldn't even dream of things we wanted to do. Sicily. Our lives were at a standstill like. Patty. I had moved in from across town. It was very bad. My kids, they used to hear gunshots at all times at night and people talking loud and all kinds of noises going on outside the window. People would come looking in the windows. Thelma. We couldn't even go out to the clothes line to hang our clothes because they'd be shooting. We couldn't go to the store. And sitting on the porch was a no-no. You couldn't even get on no porch. There were so many dealers on your front porch and back porch. People were getting killed, robbed. Oh, it was so bad. Little children walking around with no one looking after them. Police running after other children with crack. It was bad. It was so rough. Sam McKinnon, Perrine Optimists. Young men were selling drugs right out in the street, just like it was a normal transaction, no problem. Robberies were occurring at night where you would see guys brandishing guns right in front of the children. Kids were going around playing crack man. You know, they'd pick up leaves and they'd pick up rocks and they'd be selling the leaves for the rocks. Pam Gibson, Housing and Urban Development. When we first went in there, it was not unusual to have helicopters flying overhead looking for people. Obviously, the drugs were hot and heavy, and it was during the time that crack was really hitting a high pitch in fever. So we had a lot of women that were selling their daughters as prostitutes so that they would have drug money. It was a horrible place, it really was. Sam. You had prostitution being done in the open where children were able to see it. They could walk around one corner and see one guy having oral sex. And there were times at night where in the middle of the basketball court, there was a spectacle of having sex. Pam. We had a guy they call SM who had been shot by the police a few years earlier and had been in prison. And when he came out, he was never quite the same. He would come out every once in a while, cock his shotgun and tell everybody, "It's time to do roll call." So kids grew up around that. Actually, he kind of kept order because he also had this big fan-back chair that he would sit on at his corner, and he would give the guys so many cells, and then he'd send them home. He'd say, "You don't have to make that much money. You just make a certain amount." So he kind of kept them from fighting each other. Rather than 20 people running to your car, he'd send them out one at a time. "Okay, you've made enough money today. Come on." There were some real characters in Modello. Dr. Roger Mills. There were 6 entrances into the Modello project, and there was a different gang at every entrance. It was like the Burger King of drug dealing. People would drive through and get their crack and drive away. There were shootouts every night between these gangs, turf battles. It was just like the Wild West, literally. Sam. There were a lot of robberies committed by people who didn't live here, and a lot of inner violence for those who did live here, one family against another family. Pam. So many times in Modello, when we first started working there, people would not even communicate with each other. I mean, they were mortal enemies. "You don't cross my area. You don't come into my territory. You don't touch my kids or talk to them." Sam. The dropout rate was ridiculous. I think there were only 3 kids in the high school at that time. Junior high was the break point. Once they got to junior high, that was the farthest they would pretty much go. I think there had only been like a few graduates before that. It was just heading nowhere. It was a dead-end street. Pam. I remember we had one kid who would sleep out on the slide at night, and even when his parents left the area, he would come into Modello and sleep out on the slide. I'm talking about an 8 or 9-year-old kid. There was also a pedophile in the neighborhood. It was really kind of odd because nobody really did anything about it, and so you'd have your young kids subjected to that. He was a kid himself, 18 or 19, so legally he's not a kid, but mentally he wasn't there. And he was sexually molesting kids. The kids had to look at everything. You'd come home and find crack on your doorstep. You saw people getting high. You saw people doing things that wouldn't happen in your or my neighborhood. You saw people get shot and killed. You saw people die a lot. We had babies die from neglect, a lot of that. The kids there were exposed to all of that. It was chaos initially. It was hard to believe that people lived the way that they did. I mean, you don't live in your neighborhood and have helicopters fly overhead searching for people. You don't have people living in vacant units and doing whatever they want. You don't have people fondling one another in the middle of the project. A woman doing a blowjob so she can get a little bit of money for crack. You don't have that everywhere. Everything that's normal to us was abnormal to them. Major Tom Lamont, Metro-Dade Police. We staked out drug deals at Modello and got attacked. People threw bottles and rocks at us. Officers and citizens got hurt. Florida Magazine, 1087. Modello is not some fine wine. It's the ugliest welfare project in Dade County, a county with 60 ugly welfare projects, 12,000 ugly welfare apartments. Modello is near Homestead, 25 miles from Miami, 1,000,000 miles from the flashiness and big money of downtown Brickell Avenue. It is home to 100 women, virtually all of them Black welfare mothers. It is also home to 100 teenagers and 300 children who squat on asphalt, play with cartons, crawl under pilfered shopping carts. Mary lives at Modello. She fought with all her strength against moving there because she had heard stories of its crime and desolation. But she has 4 children and no job. It was Modello or nothing. Dr. William Stokes, United Way Task Force, 387. You name it, and it's a problem in Modello. Rosie, Miami Herald, 687. The image of this place has always been so bad, but it's not that the residents here are lazy. It's just that Modello has been neglected for so long. Chapter 2. The Idea, 1985 to 1987. Dade County State Attorney Janet Reno knew she had to take action. The July 1984 grand jury report had issued a stark challenge. Black youths from inner-city housing projects in Dade County were dropping out of school at alarming rates, followed by unemployment and a self-perpetuating cycle of alienation and failure. They entered kindergarten at a significant disadvantage that multiplied as they moved through school. Black males from these neighborhoods were far more likely to be in jail by the age of 25 and become involved with drugs and crime than any other group. Black females from these neighborhoods were more likely to become pregnant as teenagers. The school, the neighborhood, and family all had to assume equal responsibility. Serious action needed to be taken now. Reno assigned the task to her able chief assistant, State Attorney Tom Peterson, who had staffed the grand jury report. Tom is the only one who would be able to pull this off, she said. He hated the blight of public housing. He hated to see all those wasted lives. He was a passionate, intense person, a doer. Besides, his heart was to be working out in the field. Reno pulled together the Dade County Superintendent and the county manager to form an intergovernmental consortium to tackle the problems in low-income, inner-city neighborhoods. She offered Tom Peterson an official leave of absence from his state attorney office duties to head the consortium. Reno's office would pay 1/3 of his salary. Metro-Dade County and Dade County Public Schools would contribute the other 2/3. Tom was thrilled. He had been a Vista volunteer in the early War on Poverty days, organizing Dade County's first pretrial release program, where people charged with minor crimes could work out an arrangement with the state attorney's office to perform community service in lieu of a trial. He would now have the opportunity to prevent problems up front of crime, school failure, drug abuse, welfare dependency, and more. On April 5, 1985, Janet Reno proposed an experiment to deal with the problems described in the grand jury report. The studies uniformly reveal that inner-city students enter kindergarten testing significantly below their non-inner-city counterparts, and that the gap between the two groups widens as the student progresses from elementary school to junior high school to high school. The problem is a complex one that can only be dealt with in the context of the inner-city child's family and neighborhood. No one agency is responsible for these problems. Their solution must involve a joint effort of the schools, social service agencies, and the criminal justice system. Reno proposed a 5-point interagency effort. 1. Academic intervention. 2. Parent involvement. 3. Coordinated efforts against crime and delinquency, substandard housing and neighborhood environmental problems. 4. Organized activities and services. And 5. Economic development to enhance welfare recipients' self-sufficiency. She told Tom to let her know in which neighborhoods he wanted to start. They'd select a few, then he could pull people together and move in. With unbounded enthusiasm, Peterson set about his task. With Tom's talents, he could have been a wealthy, successful corporate lawyer, but his interests lay elsewhere. Money didn't matter to him. A good thing, because this project paid little. What did matter were victories, such as when he'd gotten 300 women who'd been arrested for welfare fraud out of jail and into community service. They'd been moonlighting, flipping hamburgers at minimum wage to pull in a few extra bucks to support their children. They hadn't told the welfare office and were nabbed. It didn't seem fair. It started Tom thinking about what living in welfare housing does to people. Now his boss was giving him a chance to do what he'd always wanted. Few state or district attorneys acted preventatively. Most were too busy reacting after the fact while poverty and resulting problems worsened. Reno and Peterson knew that only in collaboration with other agencies and professionals could they make a real difference. Tom would develop programs at the neighborhood level, with full participation from the residents in planning and implementation. This was Tom's signature talent, to pull together all manner of people toward a common end, to bring together all types of agencies to coordinate services. To begin, they selected 3 of the toughest communities in Miami. 2 were public housing projects, Larchmont Gardens in Overtown and Liberty Square. The Department of Housing and Urban Development, HUD, had to be involved, for they essentially served as landlords. Peterson worked simultaneously on 2 fronts, drawing together local and county agencies into action and hanging out in the projects to meet residents, identifying natural leaders, understand their problems, and gently bring folks along at their own pace. Tom felt quite comfortable in this role. Never intimidated, naturally friendly and helpful. Tom would hang out with anyone, anywhere. People from all walks of life usually responded in kind. In early 1986, the experiment began with a grocery store in Larchmont Gardens, operated by the residents. Not only would it provide on-premise groceries, but also serve as a training opportunity for mothers on welfare, offering them a chance to make it into the job market and stand on their own feet. It was so successful that 6 months later, a similar store opened in Liberty Square, then a daycare center. Larchmont Gardens added a preschool, a medical clinic, and Little League baseball. Service providers were deployed to the projects. It all provided a ray of hope and a new sense of spirit among at least some residents. As usual, the south end of the county felt neglected. Liberty City and Overtown always got the attention and money. South Dade had the same problems, yet it seemed no one cared. Pressure mounted from a South Dade task force formed recently by the United Way. Its chairperson, William Stokes, president of Miami-Dade Community College Kendall campus, pushed Tom to select a site in the South. Robert Thomas, a terrific guy from United Way, who staffed the task force, had recently written a report suggesting a possible site, a place called Modello. The Modello housing project was not only one of the worst housing projects around, but it had space for agencies to move into and work. Tom Peterson. When I first came down to Modello, I did what I did in Liberty Square and Larchmont Gardens, go down and hang out, and after a while try to find 2 or 3 women who seemed to be recognized as sort of leaders, then do a survey. I put together a questionnaire, and they would go door to door to everybody in the project, and I would pay them. And the people they interviewed also got $5 for participating in the questionnaire. Then we had a meeting to discuss the results. Then we started talking about the store. That was a long process. We were in our 3rd housing project, and I went back to the consortium and said, I really need an assistant, somebody else to do this, especially because of the geographic distance between Modello and the other places. Tom proved a whiz at securing grant money, and in April 1986 hired Pam Gibson, an attractive, tough, caring, blonde-haired woman to assist him. Pam had been a seasoned community organizer since 1983 and now worked for HUD. Tom had no previous experience with Modello as he had in Liberty City and Larchmont. But Pam worked in other housing projects in South Dade and knew some folks in Modello. Pam. They were always shocked by Tom a little bit. If they didn't know him through his association with Janet Reno, he was very personable and always going to people's houses. Most people come in and say, I have a program for you. He had a survey and he sat down with people. There was a year of planning and pulling together before there was any structure. They set their sights on opening a Modello store. This brought almost immediate trust. They were offering something tangible, easy access to groceries, economic development, a few jobs. Modello had no conveniences, not even a soda machine. Not that one would have remained in working order had it been there. Residents had to walk a half-mile through the weeds along U.S. Highway 1, past whizzing cars and through dust, to buy groceries at Winn-Dixie. To buy candy at Circle K store, their children had to cross the 4-lane highway and would be robbed blind in 5 minutes. Tom found the perfect spot for the store, a trashed-out community center near one of Modello's other centers of commerce, a prime crack-dealing corner. From the Miami business community, Tom secured seed funding, and the store opened in the spring of 1987. Tom and Pam hired 2 residents, Carrie Mae and Mary, and trained them to work the counter. Both were fairly typical Modello residents. Mary, for example, was a 24-year-old who had grown up in Homestead, yet had never been to Miami. She had fought with all her strength against moving there because she had heard stories of its crime and desolation, but she has 4 children and no job. It was Modello or nothing. She was a smart girl, a spelling bee champ, but she had to pick beans for a week each month, so she fell behind. In high school, she dropped out, ran off, and at 16 had her first baby. At 24, her life had run out. With Tom's connection to the state attorney's office providing instant clout, he and the United Way Task Force drew in over 20 agencies. The Department of Human Resources assigned a drug counselor. Youth and Family Development assigned another counselor. The schools became involved. Tom brought in the Private Industry Council, PIC, to provide job training. The Perrine Optimists opened a base of operations to help with crime prevention and hired Sam McKinnon. The YWCA opened up a child care center in the building appended to the store in the center of the projects. All bases were covered. Service providers descended on the projects like a swarm of bees. Pam had the task of coordinating it all. This quickly became overwhelming. Modello was not a large site, and all services were supposed to operate out of a pathetic, dimly lit set of offices behind the store. So tiny, not everyone could fit at once. Fortunately, people were only assigned there part-time. Pam arranged office hours, but occasionally they still tripped over one another. Frustration began to mount. Tom put Pam in charge of the store, which was not an instant success. It began to eat away at her time. Worse, Pam watched as the programs came in with their set packages without bothering to adjust to Modello's special needs. Pam heard many service providers complain. This client doesn't want to cooperate. These people just don't want to help themselves. When a client didn't fit the mold, the service providers blamed the clients. As a trained community organizer, always trying to meet people's needs as they defined them, Pam could not abide this mentality. She didn't see a lot of stretching to find out what about their agency programs may not fit this community. Many providers became disgruntled. They'd offer short-term programs and eventually, one by one, drop out. One agency came in with a jobs package and fired up residents about taking courses at the skills center. When completed, they were supposed to end up with decent jobs. Once the training ended, however, they wouldn't get hired. They still had no degree nor any real credentials. Expectations raised, none delivered. Hopes dashed once again. The residents became disgusted and angry and walked. Another agency sent in a young female social worker who was afraid to come into Modello by herself. She insisted in being escorted in and out. She was terrified of her clients, not overly conducive to establishing productive working relationships. It didn't last. Reno, Peterson, and the United Way had only the best of intentions, sincerely wanting to make a real difference and believing they could. They came in with cameras rolling and speeches, and they did make some difference, but expectations proved unrealistic. Residents became disappointed. Some were downright angry. Pam complained to Tom. It concerned him. Besides, a grant he had secured was about to end, and he needed to find some way of continuing funds for Rosie, the powerful resident leader he had hired. Maybe he would give a shot to this strange man he couldn't figure out, who seemed to latch on to the goings-on in Modello, who was always hanging around wanting to start some kind of program, Dr. Roger Mills. Tom Peterson had met Roger Mills through a colleague at the University of Miami. In Tom's spare time, he was involved there in a study of delinquency. His co-researcher, Dr. Nancy Peck, had met Dr. Mills, who had recently begun to teach a class there. Through her, Roger found out what Tom was doing and persuaded her to take him to a community meeting he was holding in Larchmont Gardens. Mills became intrigued with Tom's approach. Trained as a community organizer himself, Roger loved the idea of bringing together all major agencies and the university to solve the seemingly unsolvable problems of the inner city. Plus, he saw an opportunity to test out some of his new ideas. He and a few colleagues had been developing a new approach to psychology, and he wondered whether it could be applied preventatively in neighborhoods such as these. Robert Thomas, whose wife Anne was a colleague of Roger's at an institute developed to promulgate these ideas, suggested he look into what was happening in Modello. Dr. Roger Mills got out of his car and walked into the Modello housing project, looking like the man in the moon. Unlike anything that would have been walking around the projects, seemingly oblivious to all the danger and turmoil around him. With his round face, toothy grin, straight blonde, slightly graying hair that hung over his forehead, a barrel-chested football player body looking a bit worn by Father Time, wearing suspenders to hold up his pants, the man simply looked out of place. A few moments before, he'd nonchalantly waved hello and smiled at the drug gang hanging out at the project entrance as he drove in. "How are you doing?" he said cheerfully. It had taken them by surprise. From a white man, these black men were used to fear, or a deal, or the cops. Who the hell was this? They harassed him a bit to let him know who was boss, but let him pass. On his way to the building where the meeting would be held, Roger said a friendly hello to everyone he passed. They turned and looked at him strangely as he walked on by. What white man would come in here alone? Everyone else came in groups. Initially, Roger had entered with Tom or anyone he could find. After being introduced to a few folks, before long he was walking around by himself. Yet Roger's eyes were opened wide. He had never seen such a distressing community with so much drug dealing out in the open, where the neighborhood culture supported it so much that nobody wanted to mess with the drug dealers. The police didn't even want to go in. The drug dealers boldly stood on every corner, harassing or confronting anyone who drove in, who they didn't know or who wasn't there to deal. Roger heated the rundown buildings, the doors falling off hinges, the broken windows, paint peeling off walls, broken down cars, piles of garbage all over the yards, little kids running around, badly clothed, dirty, as if their health was not cared for. It was a school day, yet more than 200 kids roamed the grounds unsupervised. It looked like the middle of summer or a holiday. He watched some kids play a game that looked like drug dealer versus the cops. The drug dealers were the good guys. The project was struggling. Another woman they'd hired at the store was causing great problems, squabbling with everyone and sometimes not coming to work. Tom's intent to have the store owned and run by the residents' council seemed thwarted by craziness. Tom needed to do something. These difficulties did not surprise Roger. He understood this was the way these folks were used to coping with life. He knew it would not be easy at first to get them to function in a healthy way, beyond their own egos and personal survival needs, so they would be able to contribute to the community and help each other. Roger saw another problem. He labeled it the salad bar approach. Many services had been brought in, such as primary health care, job training, food stamps, GED courses, and daycare, in hopes that residents would come by and sample them. But the residents weren't necessarily of the mind to take advantage of those services. Roger observed that the project lacked any leadership training for the residents. He saw no attempt to raise residents' self-esteem, to bring them to a level where they would have the wherewithal and means to productively use those services. Dr. Mills asked Tom and the consortium if he could write a grant to bring that missing component into Modello. When he first entered Modello, Roger wanted to be careful not to cause a stir. He didn't want to be seen as another agency coming in with a flurry of media and speeches about what would be accomplished. He wanted only to get to know the folks, hear their stories, learn about their lives, listen to them, and have them get to know him as a human being so they could begin to trust him. Roger showed up at a meeting in Modello called by Tom and the task force. Many women scurried about preparing for the event. Roger grabbed some chairs and moved them into place. He spoke to anyone near him. His was the only white face in the audience and one of the only male faces. He had come an hour early on purpose. While helping set up, Roger carefully observed who came around interested. In the kitchen, he hung out and chatted and helped the women with the food. Afterwards, he stayed to help with the dishes, put away the chairs, and shoo out the kids. Standing outside the building with some of the residents after the meeting, he chatted some more. Eyes attuned to those who came most often and seemed most concerned, those who seemed to be natural leaders. It was all part of building rapport. Dr. Mills asked about their families, their kids, how long they'd been there. He asked whether they were working, if they wanted to work. He asked how their kids were doing in school and what they thought about the school. He tried to find out what they liked and what they were like. What were their hobbies? How many years of school had they attended? What did they think about living in Modello? What paths had brought them here? After each meeting, he asked what they thought about it, what they thought about the entire effort. He listened. He could hear their skepticism. "We've heard all this before," they said. "As soon as the press is gone, the agencies will be gone. As soon as the TV cameras aren't here anymore, we won't see the director of PIC, or the director of the county social service agency, or the director of United Way down here. At best, they adopted a wait-and-see attitude. At worst, we've seen all this before. Nothing's ever going to change here." Among the most vocal was a heavy-set, powerful-looking woman named Rosie. From the beginning of Tom's arrival months earlier, Rosie had already made her position clear to Tom Peterson. When she first met him, she had faced him with her arms crossed, eyes narrowed, suspicious. Lots of people come in here and say they want to do things, but they don't come through. Not that the residents had ever made it easy. They went out of their way to give service providers a hard time. Most providers would get frustrated and depart. The residents were testing them, and they didn't pass the test. It was the same story every time. Every time they'd be left as always with more unfulfilled promises and more dashed hope. Why should this guy be any different? In spite of herself, Rosie found herself taking a liking to Tom. He seemed different. He showed genuine concern. He didn't have an office downtown. He worked out of his car. He gave her his home phone number. Nobody had ever done that before. Besides, he was creating jobs and talking about hiring her. It took Tom only a few minutes to realize that without Rosie's support, he wouldn't get to first base in Modello. She was the unofficial mayor, head of the Modello Tenants Council. Everyone knew her. She was a tough cookie with a bellowing voice. She never hesitated to stand up and bellow for what she believed best for the residents and for herself. So Tom put her to work conducting surveys to find out what the residents needed. "What does Modello need?" she would call to the residents in a voice that demanded attention. Tom had won her over. Now, months after Tom had come in, who was this other white man hanging around? Doctor Who? Why didn't he go away when everybody else did? When Dr. Mills wasn't hanging out in Modello, he wrote a grant and submitted it to Tom, who gave it to his contacts. The task force considered giving Dr. Mills support. They had experienced only marginal success. Yes, they'd opened the store and a daycare center and brought in all those services. These had clearly made some difference, but they were not seeing much impact on residents' lives. Plus, Modello always seemed fraught with difficulties. Tom had tried to place control of the store in the hands of the Tenants' Council, but the council didn't seem to really exist. It had a name, and Rosie was apparently its leader, but it hadn't met for years. The bylaws had been lost, and they kept saying they couldn't have an election because they couldn't find the bylaws. Tom and Pam offered, "Why don't you have an election of a new tenant council and get a group you can work with that really does represent the residents?" They replied that they had to get their act together first and find the bylaws or rewrite them. Then they found all kinds of reasons why they couldn't have an election. It symbolized how things ran there. Something else needed to happen. Even though they couldn't figure him out, the task force appreciated that Mills wanted the residents involved. He wanted to listen to their ideas. He considered the residents equals and treated them that way. He believed that they could work together equally to help solve their and the community's problems. They were behind whatever he wanted to do. Until they read the specifics of his grant proposal and saw the language of what, at the time, he called psychology of mind. "Dr. Mills," they said, "with all due respect, what does self-esteem or people's thoughts have to do with the fact that their roofs are falling in, that they're dodging bullets on the way home, that their kids are involved with drugs, that their old man is beating on them and sleeping with their daughter? All these terrible things are going on in their lives. What does this have to do with thought or anything you're talking about?" Dr. Mills replied, "It has everything to do with it. The reason things are the way they are down there is that people who live there don't think they can do any better. They've been conditioned because of their upbringing or their experience with society or whatever they've learned in their lives to think that that's the best they can do. Be dependent and hustle and manipulate and steal and cheat and lie to get ahead and not trust anybody and be suspicious and think that the world's against them. I'm not saying that's right or wrong. People have reasons for thinking that way, but as long as somebody is caught up in that kind of thinking, they can't change their life. But they think that way because of the conditions they're in." "Look at that adult skills center sitting a block from Modello," Roger responded. "It's been there for as long as Modello has. It offers GED and nursing assistant training and daycare provider training. And it offers daycare while people are in class. And extremely few residents from Modello have ever gone there. In fact, the residents have been asking us to provide some of the same services that are already offered right there. When you look at how people are responding so far to what we've done, what do you see? We've sent in a ton of services, but people aren't taking advantage of them. No matter what their reasons for thinking that way, the way they're thinking is not allowing them to take advantage of those services." Despite their protests, Roger knew they were pretty much at the end of their rope and close to being willing to try almost anything. Few residents had become involved. If they held a parenting class, 2 parents might show up for the first session, then none for the second. The staff brought in to run GED classes or vocational training or promote job development would be sitting there twiddling their thumbs. The few residents who did come around almost never completed the programs. Their surveys showed that there were extremely high levels of apathy, anomie, depression, and hostility. Residents were feeling, what's the use? It wasn't hard for the task force to admit that apathy was a psychological state. It was apparently another leap to admit that therefore they had to work to try to change the psychological state. It can only change by giving people jobs, getting them more income, the task force argued. It will only change by having HUD come in and fix up the buildings and paint them so they can live decently. Roger persisted. It's in people's heads. You've got to change how people think. And in order to do that, you've got to understand that it has something to do with their thinking. No, we've got to change the conditions first. There's two sides to the coin, Roger continued. Of course, you have to have jobs and vocational opportunities and daycare and all those things available. But the other side of the coin has to be there too. People have to be motivated to take advantage of it and see it and want it and see that it's going to help them, to have that feeling of hopefulness. It's too simple. You're a white PhD. You come in there and talk psychology to these people, they'll just write you off because you're not one of them. They'll say, it's easy for you. This might work for upper middle class white people who are intellectual and have gone to college. It's too cognitive. It's too abstract to work with these kinds of people, most of whom have dropped out of high school. Tom Peterson said to him, "Look, Roger, I really don't agree philosophically with your approach. It just seems to me that community organizing and sociological realities and changing people's economic status and inspiring them through some kind of political process has always seemed to be more germane to alleviating some of the problems in a place like Modello than counseling, no matter what kind of counseling that is." Tom: I guess the crux of my difference with Mills was that I've always believed in a very pragmatic, eclectic approach to the problem. That's just my bias, that there is no one way to solving these problems. There's no one doctrine, there's no one philosophy, there's no one approach to solve such a range of problems in a community of people. You have to be very eclectic and very pragmatic and bring in whatever seems to work. The store was a good idea. It wasn't a panacea. Nothing's a panacea was my philosophy. And that's why I really object to Mills's claim that he had a panacea in a field where I don't believe there is any panacea. About the most you can do is bring together whatever loosely knit groups of people and approaches and try to keep them all working together. That's what you do. You can't try to impose any doctrine or any view on the group as a whole. That's what really bothered me. Roger really does believe he had a panacea. The task force barraged Roger with angry criticism. It began seeping into his home life. Some officials began calling him up late at night, yelling that his approach would never work with uneducated people. What they really need is jobs, not counseling. Self-esteem is a waste of time with low-income people. Newly married, Roger's wife, Clytie, began pleading with him not to answer the phone. Roger wondered if he should give it up. He came within an inch of saying the hell with it, but something in the back of his mind told him if he persevered, it would be worth it. Throughout history, when anyone tried something radically different, it was met with resistance. Perseverance had led to enormous breakthroughs in understanding and improved quality of life. "Look, let's give it a shot," Mills said. "The grant's been written. It looks like it's going to get funded. I'm down there. I've already developed relationships with some people. I've gotten the community college to offer college credit for a leadership class, and we've got about 20 people that want to take part. Let's give it a shot." Roger was learning an important lesson. He couldn't come on too strong with this stuff. He softened a bit and said, "Look, what I'm talking about is just one piece of a bigger picture. We'll work with all the people you've brought in. We're not saying that we know more than anyone else. We're just going to add another piece that will make your job easier." Roger learned that he needed to back off and start approaching the agencies the same way he did the residents. He had to show more respect for what they'd been trying and not come across as if he knew more than they did or had something totally new that they didn't have a part in. After seemingly endless meetings over a 4 or 5 month period, Youth and Family Development received a Juvenile Justice and Delinquency Prevention Grant for Roger's efforts to begin in October 1987. Mills had been hanging around in Modello for a few months, and now, before the grant money arrived, he had a leadership training class to run for the residents. Chapter 3. The Discovery, 1976 to 1987. In 1976, Roger Mills' life changed. He met Sydney Banks. For 3 years since receiving his PhD from the University of Michigan, Dr. Mills had been executive director at the Lane County Community Mental Health Center and an adjunct professor at the University of Oregon in Eugene. He was a single parent, turning the corner of 30, living in a communal household. Roger hated to be alone. He worked 12-hour days at the office, then went drinking with his friends until 2 a.m. He believed if he didn't have friends around, maybe nobody wanted to be with him, so he'd have to call somebody else and go drinking. At work, he was a hard driver who got an awful lot done. His colleagues called him arrogant, pushy, aggressive. They knew he was intelligent and knew what he was talking about, but they didn't like to see him coming because he'd get in their face and pull rank. Mills threw himself into university politics. Who favored whom? Who would be department head? Who got the best ratings from students? Roger took things very personally. His professional life was in high gear. Dr. Mills. Before I gained this understanding for myself and started to find more peace of mind and unconditional self-esteem, I thought the way to prove myself to other people or get people to accept me and like me was to prove how intelligent I was. I always had to get the last word in. I was argumentative. They thought I was obnoxious and arrogant. Then I wondered why I didn't have many friends, except other people who were intellectual snobs like me. I didn't know it then, but it's a self-confirming reality. It's a trap. You do it to yourself. It troubled Dr. Mills that the mental health system didn't seem to be helping people. He watched clients become chronically dependent on the system, sometimes for 20 years. He watched every day as they arrived at the halfway house to see their counselor. He watched as they were released. He watched them relapse. He observed many mental health staff barely able to cope, burned out, having problems with their families, going through divorces, not being able to handle their kids, drinking too much. It struck him that the mental health of the professionals was not much different than the clients. The blind leading the blind. Roger wanted to do something about it, to find out what really worked. With a dean at the University of Oregon, Dr. Mills worked to secure a research grant for primary prevention. Its intent? To test any program that might be able to show improved mental health results. Under the grant, funded in 1976, Roger and colleagues were eager to try any approach that might hold promise. Assertiveness training, parent effectiveness training, community development programs to bring together citizens to solve their community problems. They tried programs in the schools, encounter groups, grief counseling for widowed women who were depressed. They tested over 20 different approaches. One seemed to stand out. A psychiatrist friend on Roger's mental health board had returned from San Francisco raving about a seminar he'd attended called ARC, Awareness, Responsibility, and Communication. He'd been especially impressed with its trainers, Jack Pransky, who doubled as a family therapist, and John Enright, a Gestalt psychologist and former student of Fritz Perls. They were teaching people how to take responsibility for their own lives. Intrigued, Roger hired them through the grant as adjunct research faculty to come to Oregon and put together an ARC-based program called the Good Neighbor Project. The Good Neighbor Project offered public seminars followed by support groups and home visiting. Through talks, confrontation, and other gimmicks, they taught people about their belief systems, about how people really weren't victims. They just believed they were and acted that way. They talked about how beliefs become self-confirming. If you believe something, you act that way. It turns out that way and then reinforces the belief that things won't change. The Good Neighbor Project seemed to yield somewhat better results than the other pilot programs. According to Mills, follow-up interviews revealed that those who came to understand how their belief systems colored the way they saw things began to do better in their lives. They became more accepting of themselves and others, were less judgmental, less reactive, and less stressed in their jobs. They got along better with their friends and families. They felt better about themselves. The key factor seemed to be helping people to understand their belief systems. Roger Mills and Jack Pransky became friends. Periodically, they would visit. One day in the winter of 1976, George called Roger and told him he would be stopping by. Someone had told John Enright about a fellow named Sidney Banks, out on Salt Spring Island, across the bay from Vancouver, British Columbia, who was having impressive effects on people. Apparently, Banks was talking to groups of people, and their lives were changing. George didn't understand how that could happen and decided to check it out. George Pransky appeared at Roger's door, shaken. This was completely unlike George. He always seemed so cocksure of himself and his work. Whatever he'd heard had apparently shaken his foundations, and he was at a complete loss to explain it. "When I first walked in, I felt it," said George. "I saw more happy couples in that room than I'd ever seen before in my life. I'll tell you, Roger, it did something to my hope. It made me feel hope again. And that was before this guy, Sid Banks, even entered the room." Later, Banks had called into question everything George did as a therapist. "Let me understand this," Sid had said when he learned of George's profession. "People come to you in pain, so you try to get them deeper into the pain to make them feel better?" Very interesting. George was a family therapist who had problems with his own primary relationship. Banks questioned how he could help others when he didn't have the answers for himself. George left feeling extremely irritated. Yet its truth kept gnawing at him and wouldn't let go. "I never heard anything that rang as true in my life," he said to Roger, "but I don't understand what it was. All I can say is that I know he knows what he's talking about." George explained that it was like listening to an expert mechanic talk about fixing cars. Even though you can't follow everything he says, you have complete confidence of his knowledge. That's what this felt like. Roger became intensely curious. He would have to find out for himself. On a lark with the woman he was seeing at the time, Roger drove north to ferry over to Salt Spring Island, all the while saying, "This is crazy. What am I doing this for? It's the middle of winter. It's cold. It's raining. We missed the ferry. I should be home sitting in front of my fireplace or drinking with my friends." Soon Roger would experience the same reaction as George. Sydney Banks was an ordinary laborer turned philosopher as the result of a personally enlightening experience, an epiphany of great magnitude he'd had a few years earlier. A soft-spoken, shy, bearded man, with a combined Scottish brogue and Western Canadian accent, he had come to realize the spiritual nature of life and how thought created the human experience, and this completely changed his life. The story went that then a very troubled woman appeared at his door to ask for his help. He told her she must have the wrong person. She insisted. So he talked with her about what he had seen, and she heard something that in turn changed her life. Sid hadn't asked for this experience. It had just happened to him. Now he realized he'd been given a gift that could help humanity. So he began to talk with people on Salt Spring Island about what he'd come to understand. To some who listened, what he said made indelible sense. It touched a chord. Many people's lives improved around him. The word gradually spread, and people began coming over to the island to hear him speak. Roger sat in a room full of people waiting for Sid Banks to arrive. A bearded, low-key, unassuming man quietly walked in, sat down, got quiet, and began to speak in a soft voice. Roger was unimpressed, but like George, he was struck by the people who had been listening to Banks for a while. They seemed super healthy, the epitome of all his own research was trying to discover. In his extensive professional search to find what worked, Roger had never seen this level of mental health in people. These people were at ease, confident, assertive, calm, sure of themselves, genuinely loving, caring, considerate, respectful, unassuming. The couples seemed truly in love, but not clingy or phony. They were great with their kids, who were well-behaved and respectful. Roger marveled at the ease with which everyone interacted. Dr. Mills tried to impress them with his credentials. They were not interested. All that mattered to them was Roger, the person. They accepted him right away, as if they'd known him all their lives. It made him immediately suspicious. Like George, what had struck Roger about listening to Sid Banks was his absolute calm certainty, yet seemingly without arrogance. Sid even said, "Don't listen to me. The feeling inside you is all that matters." In his soft voice, Sid Banks spoke almost as a poet. pausing a moment after each phrase. People who go back into the past and bring up all their old, painful memories, their old bad feelings. This is truly psychological suicide. You're looking for some contentment. You're looking for joy. You're looking for security. If you bring in insecurity, you've missed it. And have another look. And this time, look for an answer that you as a spiritual being already have. If you look in the books of the wise, they all tell you one thing. They say, look in silence, for that is where the truth is found. They all tell you to look now, for that is where the truth is found. And they all tell you to look within yourself, for that is where the truth is found. Now, all of those mean the same thing. It means you already have the answer within your own head. You must find the answer by realizing you already have it. So you look to clear this head of yours, and when you do, your own wisdom starts to come out. In place of the garbage comes the truth. It was a wrench. It went against everything Roger had learned in psychology, but it made some vague sense. Mills had come to learn that Sid Banks shunned a following. It seemed all he wanted was to help people discover what had helped him, to find their way out of perceived problems by helping them see those problems for what they were, creations of their own thinking. He wanted to help people realize their inherent natural state of health within that was only being obscured by those thoughts. He spoke of universal mind, consciousness, and thought, and said that these three principles worked together to explain all human experience. As intelligent as Roger was, like George, Roger couldn't completely grasp what Sid was saying, but the feeling was indescribable. It played tug-of-war with his suspicions. Roger had always prided himself on eclecticism. One approach works in one situation, another works in another. Different approaches work at different times with different people. When Sid Banks talked about a deeper, more universal understanding of life, Roger's mind didn't want to accept it. He was deeply struck, however, by Sid's notion that people had something inside them so beautiful, a deeper level of wisdom and understanding, of beauty and love and compassion, far more beautiful than what people showed or what they learned to think about themselves. And it was the same for everyone. All they had to do was uncover it. Roger, too, had been struck by the hopefulness. Roger drove back to Eugene, thinking it had been a sham. Those people must be only pretending to be happy and peaceful, to put on a show for the psychologist from the States. Determined to get to the bottom of it, before long, Roger drove back to Salt Spring and rented a cabin on the lake. From there, he would sneak up on people, drop in on them when they least expected it. Convinced he would find them fighting or unhappy. No one could be that content all the time. The reverse happened. By sticking his nose in their business, Roger not only found that it wasn't a cult and nothing was lurking under the surface, he inadvertently got caught up in their feeling. Roger began to feel silly talking about his career accomplishments. He realized he only felt that need out of his own ego and insecurity. It was just what Sid was talking about. Roger had thoughts of insecurity that made him feel insecure. Then he had thoughts that if he talked about his accomplishments, he would somehow look impressive in others' eyes. So he talked that way. But it was all controlled by his thinking. It was all his own thinking. He had inadvertently made it up. It was an illusion. He only thought he needed to do it. Woo! Roger returned to Eugene, feeling happier, lighter, and more relaxed than he had ever felt. He found himself so at ease, he couldn't understand why the intrigues of university politics had ever appealed to him. He felt tranquil and content. For the first time in his life, he loved being alone. To return from work earlier, to light a fire in the fireplace, unplug the phone and simply enjoy the evening without a lot of distractions. He began to turn down his friends when they called with, "Some stewardesses are in town. Let's go drinking and party." Without really being aware of it, he began to restructure his life and to be quiet by himself and have more time to enjoy his daughter. People at the university began to say, "What's wrong with Mills? Is he sick?" He dropped out of all the wheeling and dealing. Roger found himself getting more done with less effort, making better decisions, saying things at meetings that people saw as sound common sense. People seemed to respect him more. Sid Banks began to invite Roger for weekends to his house on Salt Spring. They would relax or work on his house or in the yard. Roger kept looking for the rituals and techniques in Sid's approach. Sid said there are none. It was all in the understanding. Reliance on techniques or rituals actually took people away from that understanding because they thought the answer lay in the techniques, in something outside of themselves. So Roger stopped looking and simply relaxed. Sometimes they would spend hours barely talking. It felt wonderful to be with Sid, as it did with all his new friends on Salt Spring. Roger would go back to Eugene to find that everyone suddenly looked so serious, stressed out, tired. "Geez," thought Roger, "I was like this." Meanwhile, George was experiencing problems. He had left Salt Spring thinking it was a fascinating experience, but had gone back to his life, such as it was, and found it very unsatisfying. He tried to return to his therapy practice and found it no longer made sense. ARC had grown, and the organization now conducted trainings all across the country, but George no longer felt into it. As a trainer, he became less and less effective. His life no longer felt right. He was off kilter. George checked in with Roger and found Roger was changing. It amazed him. George began to wonder whether there really was something to what Sydney Banks was saying. After all, if Mills could change, anyone could. George asked Roger to speak at a large training ARC was setting up in Santa Cruz. George's partner, John Enright, seeing George at a loss and becoming ineffective, sent him back to Salt Spring Island with his family for the summer to rejuvenate. Before long, George's life also began to change. His marriage vastly improved. None of the self-help books he had read or any marriage counseling theories had ever helped them. Now they found themselves truly happy in their relationship. Why? It was hard to pin down. They seemed to simply start enjoying and appreciating each other more, paying less attention to what they had thought were problems, and soon their so-called problems dissipated. Roger and George began to teach what they'd been learning on Salt Spring, though they found it difficult to articulate. They simply tried to help people find the same warm feeling inside them that they had found for themselves. They decided to try to apply what they'd learned to the Good Neighbor Project. Previously, they believed, much as cognitive psychologists, that people could change their beliefs by using willpower, or by reprogramming their beliefs or reconditioning their thoughts, or by positive thinking. They believed that through techniques or activities, they could help people change their beliefs from the outside. Now it all seemed unnecessary. Change had to be realized from within, as it had for them. They now saw that everyone had within them a higher state of mental clarity or wisdom that they could realize, no matter how dysfunctional their behavior, that people could learn to see their healthy and dysfunctional thinking for themselves, and in seeing it, they would change themselves. Dr. Mills. I had been going from one thing to another. One year it would be encounter groups. The next year it would be TA, transactional analysis. The next year it would be Gestalt. The next year it would be ARC. And I started to see that it was a fad, whatever was in. But I now saw people on Salt Spring change permanently, in a very visible, dramatic way, to a level of mental health way beyond what I expected was possible. It wasn't that they were coping a little better with the stress in their marriage, or fighting a little less, or handling their disagreements with a little more dignity. They stopped fighting altogether. They saw the ridiculousness of fighting, period, and they fell in love again. The quality of the feelings in those marriages and families was 100 times nicer and positive than from any form of therapy or approach that I'd seen. The results were light years beyond anything I'd seen before, and I'd seen people that had been involved in EST, LifeSpring, Encounter, ashrams, and all kinds of trips, and I didn't see that their level of happiness or contentment and wisdom in terms of how to live a beautiful, rewarding life was much better than it had been, except maybe they'd learned to cope a little bit better. So the changes I had seen with anything in the past were marginal. This was a whole different ballgame. It wasn't even close. And that's what happened to me. All of a sudden, it seemed silly to go running around trying to find the right technique or the right ritual or the right movement to join. By 1979, the third year of the 5-year university grant, Mills began to see Good Neighbor Project participants functioning in a less stressful way than participants in any other projects funded under his grant, even better than ARC had previously. They had more self-esteem, felt better about themselves, and were more accepting of others. The reason appeared to be that these people took more responsibility for their lives. They began to see that everybody looks at things differently, so they didn't have to take others' viewpoints as personally or get caught up in people's separate realities. They saw themselves and others with more objectivity. Dr. Mills. What we started to see was that people who were learning about their own thinking, how their habits of thought led to a cycle of negative behavior and negative outcomes, which reinforced their negative beliefs. When people got caught up in that spiral, they didn't see the light at the end of the tunnel or see any way out. It just got worse. When people saw that it had something to do with their thinking, they got better and really improved dramatically compared to people in other parts of the grant. "Don't you see," Sid Banks said one day to Roger and George, "this means a whole new way of thinking about psychology and what you're teaching people in therapy and how you help people. This is how people can learn about themselves." For some reason, Sid, who talked spiritually, knew what he was saying could best go out through psychology. George and Roger were the psychologists who caught on. Together, they had fascinating discussions and gradually began to understand the implications. They began to spend a lot of time at Sid's house. "You know, I just have a 9th grade education," Sid would say. "I don't know any psychological terms. Could you teach me how to say this in psychological terms?" Roger and George would throw out terms such as, "You could call that a frame of reference." "Yeah, that makes sense. Write that down," said Sid. They thought they were teaching Sid, but Sid was slyly teaching them to express his spiritual understanding in psychological terms. They had to invent a whole new glossary of terms, thus developed the earliest depiction of this new psychology. George began to apply this new understanding to his therapy practice, meaning he had to completely alter the way he conducted therapy. He no longer took people back into the past. He no longer had them go deeper into their painful feelings. He no longer had them reframe their thinking. He wanted them to go in the opposite direction, toward their health, to realize that they had this healthy state in them, to see through their own insight how their patterns of thinking were getting in the way, so they could access this healthy state. Though George felt unsure of what he was doing, his results with clients improved. Results occurred sooner and were longer lasting. It amazed him. It soon became clear that George and ARC had to part. John Enright didn't really understand what George was talking about. Yet George had intrigued fellow ARC staff member Dr. Keith Blevins about this new psychology. In 1978, Dr. Blevins assisted Drs. Mills and Pransky in writing the first paper laying out the early interpretation of the understanding. They self-published it and disseminated it around the country through the ARC network. George and Roger formed a new company called New Psychology Associates to begin putting out this new approach. In turn, Blevins called his old Baylor graduate school roommate, Dr. Enrique Suarez, in Florida, and excited him about these new ideas. By 1979, Suarez persuaded Roger to move to Miami and start the Advanced Human Studies Institute. Rick Suarez did an enormous amount to help formulate early concepts, calling it neocognitive therapy, and they began to write a book about this new approach. By 1980, Sanity, Insanity, and Common Sense was released by a small publisher. In 1987, it was revised and picked up by a large publisher, this time co-written with Darlene Stewart, who had also moved from Oregon to Florida after becoming involved through the schools in the Good Neighbor Project. She had taken it home, applied it to her marriage, and her marriage dramatically improved. Darlene's husband, Chuck Stewart, began applying these ideas to the alcoholics he counseled and found it helped them as well. A few other psychologists began to get involved and joined the Advanced Human Studies Institute. In 1986, Dr. Jane Nelson wrote a book called Understanding, based on the early concepts. Meanwhile, George Pransky was working on a book applying these concepts to improving relationships, titled Divorce is Not the Answer, now called The Relationship Handbook, and moved his practice to LaConner, Washington. Banks himself wrote a parable titled Second Chance. Although Suarez and Mills went different ways because of divergent views, the understanding realized by Sydney Banks had begun to spread. Note update. As of the publication date of the third edition in 2011, Sydney Banks had written the most definitive and simply stated book describing the three principles of universal mind, consciousness, and thought, titled The Missing Link, as well as a number of parables among them. The Enlightened Gardener, The Enlightened Gardener Revisited. His long-awaited autobiography is anticipated posthumously. Use of the term psychology of mind died out, as its practice was based largely on a set of concepts meant to describe the three principles, instead of focusing directly on understanding the principles themselves. A number of other terms have been used to describe this understanding of how people's experience of life is created from the inside out by these principles, such as health realization, innate health, state of mind, principle-based psychology, and most purely and simply, the three principles. As terms are not important, the understanding is. As of this publication date, many thousands of people's lives have been improved and helped through this understanding, as have hundreds of communities, schools, organizations, and businesses. As it continues to spread via the ripple effect, an organization called Three Principles Global Community, Inc., 3PGC, formed to promulgate this understanding globally. Thus, in the midst of their research at the University of Oregon, Roger Mills and George Pransky had stumbled upon something on Salt Spring Island that was apparently achieving results far beyond anything they had studied. It was not unlike what happened to British scientist Sir Alexander Fleming in 1928 when he accidentally discovered something in his petri dish that he wasn't looking for, something killing the bacteria he was trying to work on, something that later came to be known as penicillin. It had finally dawned on him. Hey, this is the answer I've been looking for. Meanwhile, Roger Mills had shifted what he thought worked to change people. Change had to come from within. His eclectic self began to dissipate. He saw everything in a new light. Everything that appeared to work, he now saw as a placebo. If people believed something would work, it sometimes did. But the real vehicle for change had to be people's thoughts. Thoughts are always the intermediary between people and their lives. If people gain perspective on how their thinking creates their experience and came to realize their innate health and wisdom, then their satisfaction, peace of mind, and happiness would follow, and problems would be reduced. Anyone could learn to use their own common sense and natural wisdom as their guides, because it was already inside them for the discovering, just waiting to come out. Roger Mills was no charismatic leader. Yet within him there developed more of an inner calm, a quiet strength. He now went about his business with a quiet confidence, talking in a near monotone, eyes sometimes penetrating, sometimes darting about, taking it all in. When Roger learned of Tom Peterson's efforts in inner-city housing projects, he believed that what he'd come to understand could help achieve results there too. so he tried to weasel his way in any way he could. After all, his doctoral dissertation had been on community organizing in low-income housing. Chapter 4. Fall, 1987. With the grant money scheduled to arrive in a couple of months, Roger had his foot planted right where he wanted it, firmly in the door. He began to show up at the Modello office, taking his place alongside the other service providers. Pam did not know what to make of him. At least his heart seemed in the right place. Roger wanted to get residents interested in taking his leadership training class. He had convinced Miami-Dade Community College to support it, and to fulfill their requirements, he needed at least 15 participants. Like Tom before him, it did not take him long to realize that the class didn't have a prayer of getting off the ground without Rosie. Rosie was a force to be reckoned with, one of the strongest, most militant resident leaders, and certainly the most vocal. Rosie would complain about the mayor, the police, the housing authority. She truly cared about the plight of her neighbors and would confront anyone in her path. Rosie. I've always been semi-involved with something, but just semi-involved, just enough to, if I got mad enough, to go in there and speak my piece. And I wasn't very pleasant either. But then that was it. Then I would just stop going. Sam McKinnon. Rosie had the interests of her community at heart, but constantly faced with all the negatives in Modello, she came to accept much of what she saw happen around her. She limited her protests to what she considered blatantly negative. For example, she would keep silent about drug dealers, unless they carried a gun. Early on, Tom Peterson had hired Rosie to conduct surveys and represent the residents downtown in meetings with the county, city, and agency directors. In fact, she had helped to secure Dr. Mills's grant by going before the county commissioners with a couple of other ladies. Since her part-time funding was scheduled to end as Roger's began, Tom wanted Roger to hire Rosie. In fact, he insisted. This puzzled Roger. Tom had a mighty hard time trying to get Rosie to come to work on time. Rosie had a mighty hard time waking before noon. She loved to party late at night. Tom. I told him he had to hire her, and he didn't want to. It was frustrating since she came to work late all the time, especially since she only lived 2 blocks from the work site. But she had credibility in the community, and that is essential. Pam. Rosie was committed. She always had her community's and the family's best interests at heart. She was always very sincere. She came to work late every day, but she truly did have people at her door at all hours of the night. She really was the neighborhood's liaison. It was like having 2 shifts. Gloria would come in the morning because Gloria was a morning person, and then around midday, it was Rosie's time to come in, so that worked out fine. They staffed an office where residents could come in and they'd troubleshoot anything. They would call for anyone and get that person a service or a connection or help with a bill. They were trained in how to do that, and that's what they did for Tom. Rosie had that afternoon shift, so by noon, she would get there and sit in the office, and bundles of people would collect around her. She'd hold court and help people. She really gave people a lot of help. But then when she got the other job, her hours were extended, and mornings aren't her thing. And once she digs her heels in, then it would be very difficult. Tom. I didn't see my main role as changing people's work habits. It was more of a total thing for the community. Rosie's work habits were lousy, but there was a trade-off, and she had a lot of positives. Roger didn't want to have to deal with potential problems like this. It went against the way he wanted to move into Modello, stay in the background as much as possible, and be cheerful. Both Tom and Pam insisted on Rosie. Fortunately, he wouldn't have to face it for another month or so. Roger sat quietly by the Modello basketball court and watched the guys play ball. They ignored him. "Oh, nice pass," he began to say. "Good shot." Still, they ignored him. He began to kid them when they made a bonehead play. "Hey man, what are you doing here?" a tough guy said. "Oh, I'm just hanging around watching you guys play," Roger smiled. "I've got nothing better to do." They couldn't figure out this white guy. Was he a narc? After the game, he went up and talked to a couple of the guys and asked if he could shoot a few. Before long, he even got into a few games. After becoming reasonably visible from helping out at the meetings, on his own, Dr. Mills began going down to Modello to chat with folks as they sat on their stoops or wherever they happened to be. He learned of the chaos that ruled Modello. Women fighting in the parking lots and trying to pull out each other's hair. The men arriving at night and shooting up the place. 2 months after Dr. Mills arrived, a little child fell into a mop bucket and drowned. Tragedies seemed to occur regularly in Modello. Rosie. Dr. Mills came into Modello the same time a lot of people did, with the media wanting to do some things. We were the focus at that time. I don't know why, but we were. Dr. Mills came along, and he was sort of in the background for a while. In the beginning, you couldn't even come into Modello. This man would come in by himself. That's why I thought he had a problem. Everybody else would come in a group. One woman, she would come in and she would have to be with somebody black, and he'd have to be a man. This man would come in and actually walk around to people's houses, so that's why we thought he had a problem in the beginning. But if you want to help people, you've got to overcome that fear. Sicily. He would walk right in that project with all the drug dealers hanging on the corners, all by himself, knocking on doors. They say they thought he was crazy coming in there the way that place was, but God was with him, though. He was the first white man that really came into the project like that. He really cared about people. I admire him for that. Dr. Mills. I just wanted to get to know the people, find out who they were as people, get past the surface appearance that this is a tough drug dealer, or this is a crack addict, or this woman isn't feeding her kids. I was trying to get past all those stereotypes and labels that we all use, and just realize that they're human beings like everyone else. As you get to know people, you find out who they really are behind that facade, or that front they're putting on. Ultimately, Roger wanted to get the residents talking about their thinking and their state of mind, and help them realize how it interferes with their healthy functioning. Yet at the beginning, he knew he couldn't say anything resembling that. He had to build rapport first, or no one would listen. For now, he would just be himself and talk common sense when issues naturally arose. Oh yeah, you could probably go back and finish school if you really wanted to. He simply wanted to be encouraging, to show in an informal way that things weren't always the way they seemed. Dr. Mills had his eye on the healthiest people, those who seemed most intact, most interested or curious, who in some way wanted or hoped something would change, even if they didn't really think it would. He had no intention to try to reach the hardcore or drug gangs first. They would be the most resistant. It was their community, their culture, their turf he'd be threatening. So he set his sights on 20 or so residents, figuring if they changed visibly, if they started doing better and turning their lives around, others would at least become curious. Beyond that, Roger was shooting from the hip. He had no set plan. He was practically flying by the seat of his pants. He only knew how he wanted to begin. By teaching leadership training as a vehicle to get across some basic ideas about how their thinking affects them. He didn't really know how he would go about it. Roger knew only how he would start. He wanted a core group of 15 or 20 people out of 120 families to be trained as community leaders. He wanted people that other residents already respected. If he could help this critical mass to understand that their thinking could change, to become more hopeful, and see that things could get better if they worked together, it would start a ripple effect throughout the projects. Both he and Pam wanted these leaders to see that they could be the catalysts for change, that it wouldn't happen by somebody from the outside doing something for them. If even 10 people caught on and began to see this understanding deeply in their own lives, it would spread. They would reach out to their neighbors and touch them. Quality counted, not quantity. Depth of understanding would be far more important than having a lot of people come to meetings. Dr. Mills pegged the people he wanted. I'm offering a course on leadership through the community college. It would help you be more effective leaders in your community. You'll get credits for attending. You can bring along anyone you think might be interested. When he first approached Rosie with this idea, she half closed her eyes and shook her head slowly back and forth, her lips slightly pursed. Not interested. With all these agencies being around and the media attention focusing on the conditions in public housing, Mills continued, you really want to define for yourself what you want for your community. Come and take control of this thing instead of letting the agencies control it. Such logic was tough to fight, but some didn't think anything would ever change and were quite cynical. Others were more hopeful. Still others were angry and wanted to confront. While far from operating out of a common mindset, Roger believed most residents wanted to have a nicer family life. A quieter, more sane life. Not to have to deal with shootings every night and to sleep on the floor because a stray bullet might come through the window. Dr. Mills was suggesting this might be possible. You could get together with your neighbors and make things better for your community, he went on. It's your community, it's your program. The leadership training will allow you to decide what you want and make the agencies more accountable to you instead of the other way around. While walking the grounds one day, Dr. Mills ran into a woman named Lisa. My roof fell in and water's coming down into my kitchen and ruining my appliances, she complained. It's been this way for 2 weeks and I can't get anyone to come out and do anything about it. They don't care about us. Why should we care about doing anything? Hang in there, said Dr. Mills. Get organized, come to the leadership training, and we'll teach you ways to collectively deal with maintenance in a way that will get those people to respond better. You can't really do it alone. Lisa never showed up at the leadership class. Wherever he went, Roger listened to the residents' complaints and ideas. At the beginning, they simply chatted about the weather or their interests, such as cooking or food. Sometimes they talked about their kids. Sometimes even about how their old man beat on them. They would complain about the shootings, about their children picking up rocks of crack on the ground, because guys would toss them when the police did a sweep and their kids would come home with little rocks. Most residents then were too intimidated to take action. If I call the police on the drug dealers, they said, they'll come over and shoot me or my kids or tear up my apartment. Dr. Mills wanted them to see hope. Come to the leadership training and we'll help you see how to reach other people and bring them in. Then, once you have 20 or 30 people forming a crime watch and calling the police, they can't single anybody out, and they'll start to see the writing on the wall. Or, maintenance or management will be more responsive if you get 50 people at a meeting saying the same thing. Or, if you go meet with the county commissioners and tell them the problem and have a good turnout and get the media there. These were traditional community organizing techniques trying to show the complaining individuals that a lot of them wanted the same things, and there is power in numbers. Neither clinicians nor service providers traditionally play this role. Mills found that most of the residents were nice people who wanted the community to improve and their lives to be better. They just didn't know how to do it. They felt trapped. Roger wanted them to see how things could change, to see hope. When would you like to meet? What time of day? They reached a common agreement. The leadership training class would start on a Wednesday between 1 and 3. Most people didn't get up and get moving until around 11 or noon, and by the time the kids got home from school, and certainly in the evening, there were other distractions. They would hold the 10-week class in Sam's crime prevention office in the middle of Modello. At the first meeting, about 20 people attended. Rosie. We went to the first class, and here this man was talking about, regardless of what's going on in your unit, if your self-esteem is high, then it doesn't matter. So, right away I said, well, he ain't too bright. I just came to that conclusion. I'll stick with Tom Peterson or somebody who's going to offer me a job right now, because I ain't got time for what he's talking about. But he came back the next Wednesday and he called my house and he was like, are you coming over? Well, not really, because I don't have a babysitter. Why don't I walk over and talk to you? And I was like, I don't want this white man coming over to my house. So I said, no, I'll come over there and meet you. So this became his daily routine. The man would just not go away. I would even tell the other parents, look, tell him no. I'm going to tell him that you say no, you're not coming to the meeting. And I would tell him, The other lady said they're not coming to the meeting, and I would give him their reasons. He would say, well, I'll just take a walk over there. And I would be, will this man ever quit? Dr. Mills heard Rosie scream at him that he was overstepping his bounds. He shouldn't go around knocking on people's doors, bothering them like that. Rosie went to Pam, with whom she had a very good relationship. What am I supposed to do about this leadership class? Pam ran to Tom. Tom, who is this guy? It's not working. In spite of it, Pam saw that Roger seemed really sincere. An odd duck, perhaps, but sincere. At first, Pam wondered if this guy was for real, but she did like his attitude, his way with people. He knew community organizing. They both wanted residents to feel ownership of whatever the program, so they wouldn't be mere recipients of services. They both wanted the residents to be the ones to come up with the ideas. After all, it was their community. In the classes, chaos reigned. Everybody wanted to talk about their personal problems and complain about their neighbors or their neighbors' kids, or how poor maintenance was. None of it rattled Dr. Mills. He considered it pretty typical. It took him a couple of sessions just to get them quieted down enough so he could talk uninterrupted for even 5 minutes. Fewer and fewer people began to show up. Roger spent some time with them, then went knocking on doors asking, "Why didn't you come over? We missed you. What's going on?" "My old man beat me up. I had to go down to the food stamp office. My son got shot in the leg and had to go to the doctor." People struggled just to get through their day. Roger would have to be patient. It would take time. Relationships were the key. Building rapport was far more important than perfect attendance or starting or ending on time. In the course, Dr. Mills attempted to talk about people's thinking and their outlook. He spoke of how people learn to think about themselves, from the way they were brought up, from what they were told, and this became how they think about themselves now. Yet it doesn't mean that's necessarily the way they really are. It was just their habits of thought. His words fell on deaf ears. It didn't take. He encountered mighty resistance. Rosie. We were real hostile. We did not want to be bothered. We felt things like our roofs leaking, the roaches and the rats, were more important than some POM. Psychology of mind. I didn't even want to hear it. Toward the end of the course, the number of attendees dropped to 4. Among them was Rosie's friend Patty, who sat in the class thinking, "What is this white man trying to tell us? Come on, man, be for real." Patty. You know, we were almost doing things to make him get away. When he first came in, we'd say, "How do you know? You can't tell us." Some dropped out who didn't like what he said about thinking. It's your state of mind and how you see things. Roger could understand their response. They believed they were victims of society, victims of the housing authority. The bad guys were the police or white society. Still, when people complained about their roof falling in and how management wouldn't respond, or how the post office wouldn't deliver mail there, and all the things that went wrong, Dr. Mills took those opportunities to inject into the conversation how everyone looks at things differently and has learned to think differently. Everybody operates out of separate realities. When someone brought up that their neighbor had done them wrong, Dr. Mills would say, "So-and-so has just learned to see things that way. She's not really a bad person." When someone brought up how bad the police were, he said, "The police are just frustrated coming in here. Look how they see the community. They get rocked or bottled. Their cars get stolen. When they get out of the car, somebody drives their car off. The drug dealers hide, and everybody protects the drug dealers. They feel like the bad guys, so they just get more hostile and aggressive." One older woman in the class didn't believe the astronauts had ever gone to the moon, that it was just a big trick they did in Hollywood with sets of mirrors and stuff. Nobody could ever get off the planet and go up to the moon. What a ridiculous idea. Everyone laughed. Dr. Mills responded, "See how everyone sees things differently and believes whatever they want to believe? That's the way the human mind works. That's the power of thought. If we believe something strongly enough, that's the way we see it, and we're convinced that's the way it is." Whatever their concerns, Roger wanted to help them see that people think whatever they want. that people can change their outlook and how they see possibilities. People change what they do if their thinking changes. They began to hold classes around the community in people's apartments. Sometimes one of the ladies would offer to bake something or serve coffee. The teaching still didn't take hold. A handful of women involved themselves in the class inconsistently. Toward the end, almost nobody came. What Dr. Mills said just didn't seem relevant to their lives as they saw their lives at the time. Despite Roger's continual encouragement, the class fizzled. Some of the ladies went to Pam and said, "Well, he's a nice man. We don't want to hurt his feelings." Pam. Not a lot of people made it through that class, but Roger is a real pit bull. He kind of bites on your pants leg and doesn't let go. Then at the end, you really appreciate it. He's a very special person, and everyone got certificates at the end, because Miami-Dade gives certificates. Dr. Mills. Some came back in later, others never did. Some always thought that what I was saying was a bunch of crap. They are still angry, living unhappy lives. Some of the residents clearly had some problems. Gloria, whom Tom had initially hired with Rosie, suddenly disappeared. Her kids couldn't find her. No one knew where she was, only that she had suddenly become infuriated over a job. For financial reasons, Tom had to cut back. He only had money to hire one person to do community work, and he wanted Rosie. So to Gloria, he gave the job of managing the store. This immediately proved too much for her, and she had great difficulty figuring out prices and the mathematics of it all. Not only did she become stressed to the max, but she was terribly insulted that she had to be the one to change, while Rosie kept doing what she'd been doing. On the day of grand opening of Modello Mart, Gloria didn't even show up. Now she had disappeared again. 2 days passed. Tom kept trying to reach her so they could try to work something out, but she was furious with him. 3 days passed. Her kids still didn't know where she was. Later, they discovered that she had locked herself in her closet with a gun. She wouldn't come out. People went into her house looking for her and did not even know she was there. She only came out after her kids went to school. She would then shoot her .45 in the air. When it came time for her kids to come home again, she would retreat to the closet. 4 days later, she finally emerged. Roger had his eye on a very intelligent, attractive woman named Sandy. He had great hopes for reaching her. At times, Sandy could be quite seductive and sweet, but she was hooked on crack. Her apartment practically had become the area crack house. Sandy would wake up to people lying all over her floor, passed out on crack. She would then be surprised when the Department of Health and Human Services came to try to take her kids away, and she would scream at anyone in her path. As the starting time for Roger's grant grew near, more problems erupted. Roger wanted all professionals working Modello to be trained in his approach so they'd be more responsive, including the schools and police. He wanted everyone to start seeing the residents as healthy rather than bundles of problems or as sick, scumbags, or lowlife. He wanted to change their eyeballs so they'd see the residents in a healthier way. They were not amused. They asked Pam, "Where did this guy Mills come from?" As coordinator of all service agencies working Modello, it was Pam's job to keep everyone on track and help them know what each other was doing. When Pam saw this problem rearing its head, she became nervous. She had mixed feelings. On one hand, Pam liked the way the agencies related to each other in Modello. They held regular monthly meetings. They tracked various cases, such as child abuse, through their office, so they knew exactly who was involved with each case. They looked at the family as a whole and coordinated case management to make available a continuum of services of care. The service providers always found the meetings productive, useful, supportive. They wanted to come. In those years in Dade County, such groups did not exist. Pam and Sam and a couple of others who were there every day met each time a crisis arose. They would then hook up the family with appropriate services. When they needed a bed for drug rehabilitation, Pam would contact Tom and the task force. Tom would use his influence to free up a bed. It made their lives so easy. In fact, as Tom was getting ready to leave Modello, he joked that he wasn't really needed. All they needed to do was call up the agency and say, "I'm Tom Peterson," and they would automatically get a bed or a service. On the other hand, Pam saw many of the individual providers compete over turf. "You shouldn't be working with these kids, they're mine." Pam had zero tolerance for this attitude. Although she prided herself on her ability to get people to work together, to stop pointing out differences and start finding agreement, she'd been so frustrated by the professionals that by day's end she'd been worn out. So she could use whatever support Roger could provide. To the other service providers, Mills represented another piece of turf. They seemed threatened by this new man on the block. They were already fighting over budgets and didn't need anyone else horning in. They resisted Roger's enthusiasm to share what he was doing and train them. Roger wanted his approach to be everyone's. This annoyed them. It resulted in great disagreement. Pam. In some ways, it was understandable. Roger's philosophy has a way of rocking one's world. The other service providers were committed, dedicated people, but they were threatened by the possibility that they needed to look at life differently, especially those who worked in the drug and alcohol field, for whom Roger's concepts were a complete turnaround. They would say, "I really object to this." Why? Because you can't give people too much hope that they'll be able to break out of their addiction. You'll only disappoint them. Pam thought, "That's a professional talking? That's frightening." "I don't believe that," Roger responded. "I don't believe that we as professionals can limit someone's potential. If we believe that, how can we possibly pass on anything worthwhile to them?" He refused to buy into it. Clytie Mills. Roger stayed in there, and he was patient. He was absolutely embodying these principles. He'd be so exhausted, he'd be red-faced with exhaustion. He gets red-faced. You could see his face, and he could barely even talk a lot of times when he came home. He was putting his life's blood into it. Pam. There were a lot of conflicts, but my thing was I wasn't willing to lose any program. Roger would come to me and want other programs out because he thought that their philosophy was too far afield, but I couldn't cut them out either. For herself, Pam wanted to attend the training that Roger was offering. No one else did, except a woman named Marilyn, who'd been brought in by Tom. Roger wanted Marilyn to work as a consultant under the grant to help with parenting issues. The rest said, "We're not here to be trained, we're here to do our jobs, and we don't agree with what you're saying." Roger finally realized that he'd better quit fighting to get everyone on board. Basically, it all came down to relationships. If they had a good working relationship, then the service providers might become open enough to see that if something worked for a client they shared, it made it easier for everyone else. While marveling at Roger's determination, Pam also saw Rosie and a couple of other women kind of hang in there with him, despite calling him a crazy white man and grumbling about him always coming by to drag them out. The residents were unaccustomed to such tenacity. Usually, service providers would become frustrated by their antics and say, "I'm out of here." Roger's perseverance was a sight to behold. He would find a way to have contact, whether anyone wanted it or not. Patty and some others began to soften toward him. Patty. Lots of people come in and try stuff and get frustrated and go right back out. They didn't stick. But Doc did. He stayed. And I'm glad that he did. He's a good person. Rosie. So finally I knew he wasn't going to go away, and I'm glad he didn't now. So I just started to sit down and get into some of the things he was saying. Slowly, gradually, by October or November, Dr. Mills began to see some subtle changes in Rosie. Something seemed to be having a bit of an effect on her. Maybe he could feel okay about hiring her. As November approached and the time for the grant drew near, Dr. Mills asked the women who made it through the leadership course, "What kind of person do you think we should hire as the social worker?" One of the two grant positions had to go to a resident. Clearly, that had to be Rosie. For the other, the residents wanted a black male in his late 20s, early 30s to serve as a role model for the kids. Modello did not have an overabundance of positive African-American male role models. Dr. Mills posted the job in the paper, screened resumes, and interviewed applicants. Over 50 applied. Most had years of experience working with gangs or delinquents or in the inner city. Most were street tough and streetwise. Roger didn't want any of them. He saw their mindsets already contaminated. They held set beliefs about what those kids were like. Many were cynical. You can't reach these kids after a certain age. The grant sponsor suggested, you should hire that guy who works with gangs. No, replied Roger, he has no hope. Mills wanted a certain feeling created in the project, and that guy didn't have it. At one of the early meetings to initiate the grant, the supervisor of the new Modello daycare center heard that they were looking for a Black man with a degree in sociology or such. My niece's husband has a degree in sociology, she told him. Right now he's working at Southeast Bank. Why don't you give him a call? Lloyd Fields answered the phone. He hailed from Dayton, Ohio, with a degree from Bowling Green. Lloyd had grown up in a middle-class family. He had never been in a housing project. The other candidates had a wealth of experience. Lloyd had zero. Roger wanted him immediately. Dr. Mills. Lloyd was a natural. He was a nice guy, laid back, down to earth, a good sense of humor, funny, upbeat, at ease with himself, very low-key. He liked people. He treated others with respect. Most of all, he had that feeling. He had hope. And he was naive. Lloyd heard an offer he couldn't refuse. Why don't you ask your boss if you can take a leave of absence from your job at the bank and go to a training in this approach we're using? It runs for a week. If it makes sense to you, great. Tell me you want the job. If it doesn't, we'll just shake hands and go our separate ways, and you can consider it a vacation. Lloyd's boss said, no problem. We'll pay you to do it. Little did he know. The training took place at the Institute at Coral Gables. Pam and Marilyn, the parenting consultant from Metro-Dade Community College, also attended. Ever since Roger offered it, Pam had been looking forward to the training. First, she liked Roger, but didn't really understand what he was talking about. Second, she was dying to get away. Oh, fine. A week away from Modello? I don't care what they talk about. I'm going, she laughed. She felt a little guilty because Tom Peterson wasn't too happy about it. There's too much for you to be doing to take the time for this, he said. But Pam was burnt out and frustrated. Neither her job nor personal life were going too well. She took things too personally. Pam had the responsibility to coordinate everything going on in Modello, and they didn't seem able to do what they wanted for people. She felt frazzled and brought those feelings to the training. Among the other training participants, seated across the table, Pam saw a sophisticated, good-looking, well-dressed Black man. Lloyd had no idea who Pam was nor what to expect. The course was called Psychology of Mind, POM for short. It ran 8 hours a day for a week. Darlene and Chuck Stewart were the instructors, with help from Rita Shuford. Lloyd heard them say, everybody has self-esteem and common sense. Everyone is born with it. It's something you forget you have, but it's never really lost. The statement struck a chord. So it was like losing a set of car keys in your house. They weren't really gone, just misplaced. You could find them again. Anyone could find their health. Lloyd believed it. It made a world of sense. Everybody has common sense. Most everyone is well-intentioned from the get-go. Nobody is really bad, they just get insecure. They do the best they can given how they see things. Their best right could be wrong. In college, Lloyd had learned of Freud and about operant conditioning, of all kinds of psychological and sociological theories. None of it washed. Though majoring in sociology, he never considered becoming a sociologist or a social worker to teach what he heard. None of that psychological stuff about going back into your past history and trying to face up to all your junk and get angry made any sense to him. After graduation, he considered his degree nothing more than a piece of paper, so he tried banking. It seemed like fun. The day Dr. Mills introduced him to psychology of mind, his career changed. It was simple and straightforward, with no scientific hogwash. It was just plain real. It was right. Your behavior is via thought, Lloyd heard the steward say. Your emotions are via thought. You can get caught up in your thought patterns. But if you can drop those patterns, the true health inside you really comes out. Lloyd. It just nails it for me. And to me, it was nothing new at all. I grew up in church, still go. And a lot of things that are taught in the Bible are in this approach. I mean, bang, smack dab, right? Bullseye. But I never heard anybody outside the church say it like that. A psychologist teaching it in that way, it was so layman, the true meaning behind the teaching or preaching. When I teach it, I try to stay away from it being spiritual because people get turned off. But what you need is already God-given. You've got it right at conception. You have everything you need right there. Instead of looking out, you look in. And what you find inside and grab hold of will manifest outside. Lloyd didn't need to hear anything else. Over the next 4 days, he heard the trainers say the same things over and over in different ways. Still, it seemed necessary because other people in the room didn't seem to be getting it. Among them, a woman named Pam. Lloyd couldn't understand their confusion. Pam could not understand Lloyd's and others' enthusiasm. She fought the trainers all week. What they were saying sounded completely contrary to everything she'd been taught. Life isn't this simple, she said forcefully. She kept fighting. Calm, collected, and lighthearted, the trainers didn't react to her challenge. In the beginning, they had said this type of training would probably be different than any the participants had been involved in. There wouldn't be any information to memorize. There wouldn't be any techniques. If people allowed, it would just sink in. It wasn't a matter of knowing a lot. The idea was to feel it, to get into it on a deeper level. So the trainers talked softly and gently and gave a long break every 2 hours so the trainees could integrate what they learned. At the end of the day, they said, just go home and have a good time. Don't think about this stuff. That's what will help it sink in most. Just try to understand it for yourself instead of thinking about how to use it with others. If it makes sense to you, then you'll naturally model it for others and form empowering relationships to teach it to them. This training was certainly the opposite of encounter groups. No one called people assholes or tried to pull skeletons out of their closets. Participants weren't asked to get angry, to cathart, or beat pillows. Unlike a training such as EST, trainees weren't made to feel uncomfortable. This training consisted solely of interesting talks and discussions in a pleasant atmosphere. The whole idea was to learn about one's thinking. But it couldn't be that simple. Pam fought hard. It was an insult. On Thursday afternoon, a light bulb clicked on. Pam didn't even know why. It wasn't any one thing she heard. Suddenly, she realized that she fought it so much because what they were saying had legitimacy. This meant she would have to readjust her frame of reference. When they returned from training, Roger saw that Pam seemed much lighter. The training had a powerful effect. Pam felt it permeate her personal life. She had been so hard on herself when things didn't work out. She believed that something was wrong with her. She questioned whether she knew enough, whether she was doing enough. It threatened her sense of self. She now felt freed. She didn't know how to describe it, only that whatever she'd learned had a strong personal impact. Lloyd came back bubbling with excitement. This stuff is really cutting edge. How come I didn't get this kind of psychology in school? It's just common sense, isn't it? Dr. Mills responded. I could even see how it would help people at the bank deal better with each other and work with less stress. Roger just smiled. Chapter 5. November 1987 to January 1988. In November 1987, Roger hired Lloyd as a half-time project social worker. Rosie provided outreach and community organizing as social worker aide. Dr. Mills supervised both at 1/4 time. Lloyd. He actually hired me before he got the money. I didn't get paid for 3 months. He was saying, don't worry about it, it's going to come. Fortunately, I had pretty good savings. I was living off my savings, man. Pam. We had to lend Lloyd money from the Modello Mart at Christmas time. Clyde T. Mills. The grant started just around the time we got married. The reason I know this is we didn't get paid for 3 months. It put a little strain on Roger, but it put more on me because he handles things beautifully. Money or not, Dr. Mills gave Lloyd his work instructions. I want you to go into the schools and talk with the kids, and talk with the parents, and just see where they're coming from. Lloyd wasn't sure he heard him correctly. Just go talk to them? You're going to pay me to just go into schools and just talk with parents and kids? Is that all you want me to do? Right. Doc, you mean to tell me that all I have to do is go into the school, pull a couple of kids out of class, and just talk with them? Yes, just get to know the people. That's all I want you to do. And then what? Lloyd, just get to know the people. I'm hired. When do I start? He laughed. Lloyd, I know why he hired me. He just knew that I didn't know what I was getting into. Lloyd first arrived at the Modello housing projects at 10 a.m. on a Thursday. He looked around in bewilderment. Dr. Mills had told him a bit about Modello before he appeared, but this was nothing like he imagined. Oh boy, he said to himself, what am I going to do now? Kids were running all around. Lloyd had only been in Florida for a year. He was still trying to get accustomed to November being warm. Now he walked into Modello and he looked, and it was a school day, and all these kids. It stopped him in his tracks. A lump formed in his throat. It seemed like July. All these kids were outside playing, but it was a school day. And he saw the drug dealers and unattended little toddlers running all over the project unsupervised in their filthy diapers. His eyes moistened. Where are the parents? Lloyd wondered. Where's the truant officer? He then saw a sight that would be forever etched on his soul. As if in slow motion in the midst of the craziness, he saw a semi-naked little toddler running. All she had on was her mother's negligee, just running around with this thing hanging off her. He could tell she hadn't been attended to for a very long time. Tears filled his eyes. What is going on here, he wondered. This is literally another world. It was the opposite of all he was used to. It reminded him of a Star Trek episode where Mr. Spock and Captain Kirk traveled into another dimension and saw their exact opposites. That's what Modello was. Lloyd stood in his suit and tie, dressed for work at the bank, eyes opened wide. He hadn't grown up in poverty. In the middle class, you were raised to go to school every day. It wasn't a question whether you'd go to college. It was, which college are you going to? Lloyd was raised with morals. Modello blew him away. The rules were entirely different. That meant in Modello he couldn't play by outside rules. If he did, he would likely get hurt. Modello was Dodge City without Wyatt Earp. Police were scared to come in. The place contained everything one could think of as bad. At any given time, somebody could be shooting. Prostitution abounded. People would steal things from the businesses around Modello and come inside to sell the stuff. A man approached Lloyd, bag in hand. Hey man, you want some of these steaks? $5. Lloyd peeked in. A whole bag full of fresh steaks. The man had just stolen them from the Winn-Dixie around the corner and was selling them to get money for drugs. Lloyd arrived at the office shaken, but not letting on. Dr. Mills introduced him to Rosie and to Pam, the woman from the course. Mills sat Lloyd down to talk, but soon left him in Rosie's care. Many women passing by came through to check him out. Sandy came in, beaten, bruises everywhere, a huge cut on her leg, tore up, barefoot, laughing. Rosie said, "Good God, child, what happened to you? You look like walking death." Sandy laughed a strange laugh. "Ha ha, I am walking death. My boyfriend just pistol whipped me with his Uzi." She then turned about face and walked out as quickly as she'd entered. Bewildered, Lloyd looked over at Rosie, who kept on talking. "You know," Lloyd interrupted, "this is an entirely different world. That girl is on crack, and her boyfriend is selling drugs," Rosie offered matter-of-factly. "That's one of the people we're going to have to deal with sooner or later." "Oh, okay," gulped Lloyd. Yet the people treated him warmly. The minute he opened his mouth, they knew he was green. They looked him up and down. "You're not from here, are you?" No. You're not even from Florida, are you? No. Where are you from? Ohio? I knew you weren't from around here. I know you're not from around here. Lloyd. The women saw me as somebody different, and the guys there, a lot of them were drug dealers. They were kind of testing me out. It took about a year before they started warming up to me. The older guys watched me and would keep me at bay. They would let me do what I wanted to do, but I better not do anything threatening, like appear to come on to one of the ladies. I didn't know whose lady or girlfriend was whose, and it wasn't about that. But they looked at me as a threat. They weren't sure whether I was so clean-cut and wore a tie because I was a police officer or what. They never would approach me directly. I never would approach them unless I knew beyond a shadow of a doubt that they knew where I was coming from. Otherwise, if I pushed their insecure button, they might try to harm me, and I didn't want that at all. So a lot of times, at least for a while when I would go walking around, I would be with Rosie, and she would introduce me to people. Then after the introduction, I could go and talk to them. Lloyd, he said to himself, if you just do things common sense-wise, at best, they won't bother you. And if the worst happens, at least you got yourself covered some way or a backup somewhere. Common sense told Lloyd, when in Modello, lock your car and don't leave anything in it that might draw attention. When knocking on a door, step back and to the side in case some hothead shoots through the door. When trying to talk with someone upset, say, why don't I come back later? Not press the issue and wait until they calm down. Never approach anyone like you're something special. Just try to be respectful. Don't be seen as threatening in any fashion. When around the ladies, don't come on as a man that desired them, even if they make the approach. Always stand back when talking with them, and talk when others are around so it's always safe for everyone. Dr. Mills instructed him, just get to know who you're dealing with, have a good time with them, develop a rapport, and then if they have any problems, see how you can help them out. Those were the only criteria. Otherwise, Lloyd was pretty much on his own. At the bank, they told him step A, B, C. Not here. Here he heard, find out what's going on with this kid and see what you can do to help rectify the problem. Or Doc, as Lloyd started calling him, would ask, what do you think should be done with this person? Lloyd felt trusted and completely supported. Pam saw immediately that Lloyd had a wonderful way with people. Ever since Pam Gibson had returned from the training, she had lightened up considerably. Before, as a hard-bitten community organizer for HUD for 5 or 6 years, she took everything seriously. Roger noticed her now more buoyant, more fun to be around. She engaged people in a nicer way. She laughed at herself more. Before, the antics of the service providers really bugged her. Now she began to see their behavior as interesting, almost comical. She now could see that while it was fine to bring in an array of services, unless the residents themselves believed something had potential to change in their lives, none of the services could do much. Roger's philosophy brought the missing link. It renewed her hope. She started to believe again that she and others could do something to affect the way the residents thought about their lives. This, in turn, would allow them to want to take full advantage of the services. She could now see how many of the Modello women, who believed life didn't offer a whole lot, set up blocks and limited themselves. Pam could relate to that. She had done the same in her own life, in a different, more subtle way. Pam now felt freed from her own limitations, from feeling the world closed off. From her new perspective, she saw how the limits and blocks revealed themselves, such as how the residents dealt with the young neighborhood pedophile who had molested some children. The children were brought to Pam, who sat down with their mothers. "We need to stop him from doing this to your children," Pam exclaimed. "I'm not looking for punishment. I'm not looking for this kid to be stuck in a jail cell, but he obviously needs help." They called the police and arranged for the children to get to the rape treatment center. The parents dropped the ball. The police phoned. Pam, she didn't bring her kid over. Pam recontacted the mothers. "You know, Pam," they said, "this stuff happened to me when I was a kid. You get over it, and you move on. That's life. I was raped too." A lot of history. A lot of beliefs about how life is, a lot of limitations. If they believed there wasn't much they could do about it, why bother? When Dr. Mills had initially arrived in Modello, about 80% of its middle school students were truant. Almost no Modello young person attended high school. Most dropped out at their first opportunity. Parents complained regularly about how teachers treated their kids. Middle school-age youngsters were the official target population specified in Rogers' Juvenile Justice and Delinquency Prevention Grant. Soon after he hired Lloyd, he brought him to the Homestead Middle School to meet the principal. "What do you want to do in the school?" the principal asked. "I'd like to have Lloyd meet here with the kids from Modello, get to know them, and be available, and maybe do some self-esteem classes." "Hey, if you can do anything with these Modello kids, be my guest. They're my biggest headache in terms of suspensions, discipline problems, learning problems." The principal offered Lloyd a room in which to counsel. Lloyd's job: work with any student from Modello. Dr. Mills wrote another grant for $6,000 from the Babcock Foundation of North Carolina to conduct teacher training. He presented his intentions at a faculty meeting. The teachers groaned, "Oh, the Modello kids." Maria Garcia, Homestead Middle School teacher. A lot of people teaching, not just here, think that these children are subhuman because they live in drug-infested neighborhoods. Their mothers are crackheads, their fathers are drug dealers, or their mother might be a prostitute. How would I feel if my mother was a whore and I go to school with these kids and see her out there in the street? Or that my father is in jail for selling dope or whatever? Or that my mother or father is a homosexual? These kids are living that kind of life. It's a very different thing than, say, the way I grew up. If a kid was having problems with a teacher, Lloyd would talk with that teacher. When needed, he would serve as a go-between, between teacher and parent. But the more Lloyd worked with the kids as Doc instructed, the more he saw a different need. "Doc, I could do a lot of things with the kids, but if the parents aren't connected, the kids go back to the same situation and we end up fighting against the same thing. I want all of us to be on the same team, working together." So Lloyd focused on getting to know the parents and being available to help them out. He wanted all the residents to know they could talk with him anytime. It didn't have to be behind a desk. Mostly he talked under a tree, by his car, in the store, in passing. Walking along, someone would say, "Oh, Lloyd, I meant to talk to you about so-and-so." Lloyd learned quickly that the residents truly respected Rosie, and he gained a lot of respect through her. She knew what went on in their lives. She knew what they needed. Rosie and Lloyd developed excellent rapport. She was a huge help to him. One of them would say, "You know, this is a difficult person." Then together they would create a plan for how they could reach her. In Lloyd's first weeks, Rosie brought up the case of a lady blasted out on drugs. Hot-mouthed, she would cuss out anyone, anywhere, anytime. She would curse her own kids and say she hated them. She neglected them. One time she said, "Hey, Rosie, I'm trying to be a lesbian. I got me a girlfriend and I'm trying to get into this thing." Another time, she caught her room on fire and burned the bed. She was out there. "Lloyd, this lady needs some help," said Rosie. "I told her that you could help her out." "What type of person is she?" "She'll probably cuss you out. You gotta be careful. Just watch her." Her kids weren't going to school. When they did, they came late. Her 7th grader had been truant for 30 to 40 days. When she did come to school, she stunk. She wasn't clothed properly. The kids at school made fun of her. She'd fight back and get suspended. She'd get right in your face and scream. She always got in trouble because she'd cuss out her teachers and call them foul names. "You want to go over there, Lloyd?" asked Rosie. "Yeah, let's go." "Are you sure?" "Let's go. But what I want you to do is introduce me. I just don't want to walk up to this lady's door, she not knowing who I am." Rosie knocked on the door. "Who is it? Who the fuck is it?" she screamed from inside. "Samantha, this is Rosie. I brought the guy in here to talk to you about your daughter, Felicia." "I don't feel like talking to him now. Go on back to the office. Get the fuck out of here." "Well, he's here now, Samantha. You might as well talk to him. He ain't going to talk to you for long because it's almost time for him to go home anyway. Why don't you just, all right, hold on a minute. They waited about 5 minutes, guessing she was straightening up or something. The door opened. Lloyd looked in. He saw only 1 or 2 pieces of furniture and a mattress on the floor. Lloyd said, "Hi, how are you doing?" The woman started right in. "Well, Felicia, she did—" "Well, I don't want to talk about that right now," Lloyd interrupted. "I just wanted to introduce myself, see how you were doing, and just try to get to know who you are, so you'll know who I am and stuff. So if you feel like talking or anything, you can. If you really want me to go, I will, but since Rosie took the trouble to come along, why don't we just talk for the rest of the time I'm here today?" All right. I don't want to talk right here around the kids. Can we go over to your office and talk? Because a lot of people around here, they got itchy ears and they're always talking." Back at Lloyd's office, Samantha opened up almost immediately and started to cry. "Felicia's not going to school, and no matter what I do, I scream at her, I beat her. She don't do what I tell her to do, and the other kids, they don't ever do what I tell them to do. And when I leave the house and go do something, they always tear up the house. They never do what I tell them to do. They never come home when I tell them to come home." Lloyd stayed low-key and friendly. At first, he wanted only to help her calm down and get her bearings. He didn't want to talk right off about the issues. He'd rather talk about anything else. Gradually, she began to settle down. She didn't curse him out. People knew not to mess with Samantha, but Lloyd was non-threatening. He really wanted to hear what she had to say, and she was respectful in return. He didn't tell her she wasn't fit to take care of her kids. He wanted only to help her regain her mental health, her family functioning. To do that, he first had to develop rapport, help settle her down enough to trust in what he had to say. Lloyd said as little as possible, just let her talk. No sense saying anything if she wasn't going to hear it and would reject it out of hand. Once she calmed down and her level of insecurity with it, when her rapid-fire habitual thinking had slowed down, he said, "Well, here's something you might want to look into. Maybe let's go talk with the teacher about Felicia." "Those teachers don't like me." "Well, I'll go with you. We can just talk about how to help Felicia, instead of just talking about what Felicia does. We already know what Felicia does. So we can talk with the teacher and just make some kind of a game plan to encourage Felicia to get back into her books. And even more than Felicia, I'm concerned about you, Samantha. See, I'm just a social worker. That's all I am. I'm supposed to be the expert, but I'm not really the expert. You're the expert. You have much more power in helping Felicia out than I have. If I could help you out, I don't need to go to Felicia. We can just sit and talk a little bit, and I can give you some golden nuggets, as I call them. I'll let you handle it." Lloyd knew she had the power to make the life changes she needed. So long as he saw that and kept the focus on it and showed her respect and didn't treat her as a bundle of problems, maybe she could rise above them. Samantha wouldn't take any constructive action. "Just be patient," said Dr. Mills during his supervisory sessions. These consisted of coming down to Modello 2 or 3 days a week around noon to have lunch with Lloyd and Rosie, and asking which clients they were having trouble reaching. "Keep calling back," Doc said. "Every time you see her or her daughter, say hi and be nice to her, and be available and tell them you want to help if she needs it. Like to help her talk with the teachers to help her daughter not get suspended. Just back off, have patience, and maybe eventually she'll come around." Lloyd persevered. Sometimes Samantha would test him to see where he was at. She would attempt to get money out of him. Lloyd held firm. "Are you sure you don't want a woman?" she asked one day. "You know I could be your woman." "No, that's not what I want." Lloyd was intent on staying the course. When she was with him, she would be treated with respect, period. She gradually began to listen. Slowly, Lloyd began to help both Samantha and Felicia see how she could exist in school in a way that would make it nicer for herself. Finally, Samantha agreed to meet with Felicia's teachers, provided Lloyd was present, and gradually, Felicia began to come to school more often. She still got into trouble, but started to pay a little more attention to how she dressed. She didn't smell as bad. Her clothes were less trashy. Over time, Lloyd helped Samantha get into a drug treatment program, albeit not one operating from Doc's philosophy because there weren't any. Samantha didn't make it through. Not long after she left the drug treatment program, she moved out of Modello. By this time, she had calmed down some, but was still pretty wild. Later, Lloyd heard that she went back to drug treatment again and was getting on with a more stable life. Lloyd considered this an acid test on where he was with operating from this inside-out perspective and whether he could be successful. In some respects, he felt successful. He was able to interact with Samantha in a way no one else had been able to. She wouldn't talk to many people, but she listened to Lloyd a lot. By the time they moved out of Modello, Felicia was doing a little better. At the school, Lloyd's marching orders were, at first, just go out and make friends with the kids at the school. Don't deal with any of their problems, just create a good feeling. Creating a good feeling was Lloyd's specialty. Before long, many of the Modello students naturally wanted to be around him, to go see him when they had problems. He asked them to come in and talk individually whenever they felt the need. He took referrals when they got into trouble. Lloyd conducted a mini-assessment to learn which students came from Modello and, through the school's locator, found when they were in which classes. In his first year, Lloyd counseled 28 students from Modello families. This was a far cry from the school's old approach. Previously, when a Modello student got into trouble, the school sent home a curt note about what their child did. Some parents didn't even know how to read, but since it came from the school, they assumed there had to be some problem. They thought the school officials were prejudiced against their kids and didn't care about them. Lloyd wanted to bridge the gap. He knew the parents cared. They just didn't know how to approach the school. Maria Garcia. The problem was that it was easy for the kids to stay home and nobody would do anything about it. So with all the field workers Roger had out there and all his people getting into that community, that made a lot of those kids come to school because there was always somebody around there. There wasn't going to be a child that went out one morning and say, "Hey, my mom's not here, I'm not going to school," because there'd be another mother there to see them. When they knew there was someone supervising them, it made a difference. Now, when the administration received an office discipline referral from a teacher about a Modello student, the office referred directly to Mr. Fields. Lloyd would ask the student, "What happened?" "The teacher did blank to me." Lloyd tried to appeal to their common sense. What would you have done if you were in the teacher's shoes? How could you have avoided this situation? Sometimes students would come in so upset they wouldn't respond. Lloyd then said, "Well, why don't you just sit here in my office for a while to cool off for a little?" No sense talking if the kid wasn't responding. Otherwise, he'd end up in preach mode. It wouldn't penetrate. He had to be patient and give it time. When they calmed down, he would come back and talk. Although the leadership class had ended without effect, out of the chaos, Rosie, Patty, Carrie Mae, and one or two others could at least begin to serve as a core group that could provide direction. It was a start. Doc asked them what they wanted to do next. Pam hired a few of them to conduct a survey asking residents what they wanted for their community and for themselves. The survey showed that Modello residents wanted more control over their kids. They wanted their kids in school. Doc took the cue to maybe start a parenting class and organize some form of residence council. HUD balked at the idea of a tenants' council. Dr. Mills didn't want to ruffle feathers. They needed another vehicle. "How about starting a parenting class?" he asked Lloyd. "Well, that would be good," Lloyd answered, "but people might be kind of offended and say, 'Who are you to tell me how to raise my kids? I got 8 kids already.'" "What about a PTA, Parent-Teacher Association? That might make it easier to get people out. Then if parenting issues were raised, they could deal with them there." They agreed. It would be largely Rosie's job to get people out. Chapter 6. Late Winter, Early Spring, 1988. Curiosity and food brought out the residents. To kick off the first PTA meeting, Rosie and Lloyd knocked on doors, inviting the residents to a potluck dinner. Many came out for the feast. But as the PTA first began to meet officially, very few attended. Rosie, Patty, Carrie Mae, an older woman named Miss G, who would do anything to have some kind of social event in her life, all from the remnants of the leadership class. A new lady named Lisa, and maybe one or two others. Even with all her persuasive powers, Rosie was unable to get many to come out. Those who came didn't arrive on time. When they did arrive, they wouldn't get down to business. Unruffled, Dr. Mills and Lloyd intended to keep it light. They discouraged finger-pointing and blaming. At first, it didn't work. Well, your son did this. Oh, yeah? Well, your son did that. Now, wait a minute. We've got to have some ground rules here, said Lloyd. That's not what we're here to talk about. We're not here to talk about problems, per se. We're just here to get to know each other. Many residents didn't even know their neighbors in the next building. Modello had become such a fearful place that many people didn't want anything to do with their neighbors. Designed to be informal, people came to the meetings in whatever state of dress and hair they wore in their own homes. No one cared how anyone looked. Nor did anyone care to make a distinction between the PTA and the soon-to-be parenting class, which started as an outgrowth and became one and the same because the same folks attended both. They bounced back and forth between the two subjects, depending on the issue being discussed. The staff used no set curriculum. They only dealt with whatever issues arose in the moment. Dr. Mills wanted to use this vehicle to teach the residents about thought. It was anything but easy. The first official parenting class began in chaos. The ladies came in laughing and joking and could not settle down. Okay, could we start? Dr. Mills said finally, patiently, but edged with, let's get down to business. They wouldn't. Dr. Mills began by saying that he just wanted to find out some things about them. If you want to talk, you can, and if you don't have to. You should know that whatever's said stays between us. If there's something that you feel is too personal that you don't want to share with the group, you don't have to. They sat around and talked. It seemed nothing like a class. The ladies thought Dr. Mills silly, that it was all a bunch of bull. Lisa poked the lady sitting next to her in the ribs. What time does all my children come on? She whispered. I've got to find a good excuse to get out of here. In February, Rosie had knocked on Lisa's door and said, come on to this parenting class. Reluctant, but feeling she had nothing to lose, Lisa agreed. As she sat in that first class, she didn't like what she heard. Nor, apparently, did the other ladies. Everyone gave Dr. Mills a hard time and didn't really listen. At age 5, Lisa had lost her father to divorce. Her mother remarried, then divorced again. At age 12, Lisa and family were placed by a social worker in the Modello housing project. By age 18, Lisa had her first baby. A year later, her mother moved out. Lisa stayed. She had no other place to go. The neighborhood had changed around her. When she first arrived in Modello in October 1972, the housing project was fairly new. Residents were a mix of Hispanic, white, Black, Asian. As the years passed, the project began to deteriorate. Everyone moved. Lisa stuck it out. Many African American families moved in and became Modello's dominant population. Only a handful of Latinos remained. HUD records for Modello showed 1% white Anglo. Lisa was the one. She paid it no mind. She was fully accepted and got along well with everyone. Her children were of mixed race. When Dr. Mills initially came in, Lisa had refused involvement. Pam watched her walk across the grounds, disheveled and depressed. Very, very depressed. Angry. When Pam did speak with her, Lisa always talked about what was wrong. With the projects, with the world, with men. How she wasn't going to get anywhere, so just accept it. Lisa had become suicidal. She had 3 children. She felt horrible that they had to live there, that she couldn't do any better. Growing up, Lisa had little self-esteem. At age 7, she'd been sexually abused several times. By the 8th grade, she'd dropped out of school. She'd never had a father figure. She was bitter. She didn't feel she belonged. She never felt quite good enough for anybody. Her personal relationships suffered. Lisa. I was always trying to be who that person wanted me to be. I was trying to satisfy other people. I was always trying to make other people happy so that they would like me or even love me. But I didn't like myself, and I didn't love myself, and I didn't realize that. Other than raising her children in the mess she was raising them in, her biggest source of depression was her children's father. They'd been involved for 6 or 7 years but weren't married. He promised marriage. Lisa thought, this is what I need. If I had this man with me all the time and we could start this life together, this is what's missing. If I had this person, this is all I'd need. I would be happy. Her man kept promising. It's not going to be long until we're going to be together the way we want to be. We're going to get married. We're going to get the kids out of this. Over the years, he'd said it many times. Lisa put all her faith in him. She was totally faithful to him. She wondered whether he was being faithful to her. So she would make him faithful. She would make something of her life. Maybe she would go back to work. Well, you've got the kids, he said, snuffing out the notion. Maybe she would go back to school. You've never completed anything, he grunted. You're not going to do anything. Lisa bought into it. She'd been on welfare for 2 or 3 years now. It looked like that was all she could do. It stuck in her craw. In October, the year Dr. Mills arrived, Lisa gave birth to her 3rd child. By January, Lisa discovered her man hadn't been faithful after all. Her emotions hung on a thread. She tried to break their bond, but she needed him too much. So confused, so unhappy. Suicidal thoughts flooded her head. Serious thoughts of homicide. As he went into his bathroom to take a shower, Lisa went for his closet and reached for his .45. Head buzzing, baby in one arm, gun in the other, she moved to the bathroom. She pointed the gun at the glass shower door. Something whooshed into her head. Don't do this. Get out, it said. In her other arm, she noticed her baby. Don't do this, the voice called again. It's not worth it. Lisa trembled. Baby in arms, she turned and pushed open his front door and began the 2-mile walk home to Modello in the darkness. Devoid of any thought of danger, she wandered across the street without noticing the cars, without perceiving any cars. Horns blared. A car careened around her. She jumped, nearly getting hit. Fear overtook her. She couldn't imagine handling her devastation. Finally, she made it home. The next morning, the kids began to get on her nerves. The least little irritant drove her up the wall. Everybody's trying to run me crazy, she screamed. It's always gimme, gimme, gimme. I never get anything back. Lisa, the mother, had to give herself to her kids, but she had nothing left to give. A scary thought hit her, a terrible, horrifying thought, a thought she could never admit to anyone. She did not want to be a parent, at least not now. It was too much to handle. Lisa felt horrible. How could you think such a terrible thought? Lisa berated herself. Then she cried and cried and cried. Her kids felt the burden. What's going on with Mom? They asked each other during her crying spells. They asked each other if they'd done something wrong. They hadn't. Meanwhile, Pam had her eye on Lisa. Something about Lisa really appealed to her. Pam asked Rosie about her. Lisa was a hard worker with lots of potential, but so obviously down in the dumps. Pam wanted to involve her more. So after Lisa began attending the parenting class, Pam called her into the store and offered her a cashier's job. Her last job had been pulling weeds, working with plants in a nursery. She had never been anything like a cashier, but truly wanted to try it. No, she replied wistfully, too afraid she'd fail, too afraid everyone would know she wasn't smart enough or capable enough. My kids are still a little small, she said. Pam seemed disappointed. Lisa walked away grumbling to herself. A real nice excuse. It took about a month for the PTA to attract a crowd. When they began to talk about the issues they faced in Modello, the police busts, HUD not taking care of the buildings, school problems, truancy, drugs, their kids, people came out to complain. It took about another month for numbers to dwindle. Rosie practically begged people to come to try to solve the problems together. The residents refused. They thought nothing would change. They'd only be wasting their time. Rosie. I started to talk with the other parents in the housing project because a lot of the parents, they were like, I ain't going over there. No, that man's crazy. There's something wrong with him. Rosie, Doc, and Lloyd could only assure them that the door was always open. After a month or two, Lloyd began to feel comfortable in his role. His first step, to see the people as basically healthy no matter what they were going through. His second, to build rapport. His third, to listen. Fourth, once rapport is established, to talk about thought and common sense indirectly as they related to the problems residents were experiencing, and hope and trust it would somehow begin to sink in. Life in Modello never ceased to amaze. One day in a conversation with one of the ladies who worked in the Modello store, she said playfully, "Well, Lloyd, you're so soft, so sweet." In his deepest, gruffest voice, Lloyd growled, "What do you mean?" They had been talking about what it was like living in Modello and how people there showed love. She told Lloyd that a man would show her love by beating up on her. "What?" "Yeah, if I get beat on by a man, I say, this man must really love me." Shocked, Lloyd said, "Well, I don't get into that. I don't beat my wife, and I love her. Why do you think it has to be that way?" She didn't really have an answer. It was simply how she'd learned to see love. All the women loved Lloyd. Clearly, in Modello, the drug dealers were the biggest, most obvious problem. They caused the shootings. They had everyone living in fear. It was the first thing that struck anyone who drove down US 1 and turned onto the street to Modello. Drug dealers stood at every entrance. Pam had worked in many HUD communities, and in every other project, unless they thought you were there to buy drugs, the dealers would move off. In Modello, they would boldly stand. No one in the community would do anything about it. So long as the people in that project supported the drug dealing, with its attendant crime, prostitution, and crack houses, the dealers knew they were protected. So long as they kept people in fear, they would have no trouble. The service providers weren't any more keen on dealing with the drug dealers than the residents. They were the enemy, evil incarnate. Officer Tom Cheney of the Metro-Dade Police worked the midnight patrol into the wee hours of the morning and weekends in the area encompassing Modello. Modello was the hotspot, the place to go to look for crime. Cheney believed the Modello residents must be either pro-crime or they lived in fear of the criminal lords operating there. Virtually every Modello apartment became a refuge for the drug dealers. Prospective buyers could travel US 1 or 152nd Avenue, both heavily trafficked, swing onto 284th Street, make their buy, and quickly move back into the flow of traffic. The police would pull up to any of the Modello corners where young black men engaged in drug sales and boldly stand and eyeball any marked unit that came along. If they possessed drugs, they'd set them down carefully and slowly back away from their stash. They'd make no move unless an officer got out of his car and started after them. Then they'd take off like a shot into the maze of the projects and duck into nearly any apartment. The residents would yell, "9," a signal that the police were coming. It was a law enforcement nightmare. Cheney was shot at 2 or 3 times during his stint around Modello. It was a lot safer to concentrate on the buyers than on the dealers. When Pam had first entered Modello, the drug dealers were careful to steer clear of her. People used to come in the store and check her out. They couldn't figure out what the white chick was doing there. Everybody thought she was a narcotics agent. The store had to be a screen. She's got to be a narc. If they have the money for that store, there must be narcs everywhere at Modello. Early on, Pam recognized one of the dealers. Lamar was the son of a former client of hers from another project. He'd been in prison on a non-drug offense and was back on the streets selling drugs in Modello. Lamar had become the first of the drug dealers to come into the store and nose around. He would pop his head into the back where Pam worked, ask a question or two, then leave. His visits became more frequent. On Pam's walks around the project to escape her cubbyhole, she would see him on the corner and go up and talk to him. People thought this terribly bizarre. All the guys would watch. "What are you doing here, lady?" "How's your mom?" Pam asked casually. "What's happening?" Then she went on her merry way. One day, Lamar meandered into the store and said, "You don't know anything about business." Pam laughed. "You're totally right. I don't know shit about business. Why? What do you want to tell me?" "Well, you can't have those things near the door because those kids are ripping you off all the time. Every small thing you put near the door is going into their pocket." "Well, I never thought about it. That makes sense. We shouldn't put the small things near the door. You need to move this over here. You need to move that over there." Lamar was a talented businessman. He knew things Pam never thought about. He began to give her tips about the way she carried the money out of the store. "Don't you know there's about 6 guys up here that are always thinking of ways to conk you upside the head and it's only because you got some protectors out here that you ain't been hit yet." "No, I didn't, but I'm kind of oblivious," she laughed. "I just kind of get in my car and go." "Listen, this is what you need to do, but I'm going to let everyone know that you're hands off and nobody can touch you." "Please do. I really like to feel protected wherever I am." Slowly, they built a relationship. No, she didn't approve of him dealing drugs. No, she didn't like him fencing stolen goods. But if she told him how she felt, she knew it would be the end of their relationship. One time, she had no choice. "Listen, you know I've never gotten into your business, but you can't conduct business in front of the store. I'm not going to have you selling your stolen goods here." "How did you know that?" "It doesn't matter how I know. Just know that I know it, and I'm asking you as a friend to not do it. I'm not telling you to not do it. I'm not telling you how to live your life, but I don't want that happening in front of the store. You know why we came in here. You know that we're trying to improve the lives of the residents, and I don't want this happening here." Lamar responded respectfully. He stopped selling in front of the store. Rosie was doing a good job helping the other residents and was invaluable to Lloyd, Pam, and Doc. Unfortunately, since her work schedule had been shifted to the morning, she began to not show up for work on time. As her supervisor and the man responsible for the grant, Dr. Mills had to confront her. Rosie was not amused. "Don't you know people come to my house anytime, 24 hours a day, and ask me for help?" She saw it as an intrusion into the way she ran her life, and Dr. Mills didn't have the right. Yet when Dr. Mills needed her to show up for a 10 a.m. meeting with the Private Industry Council or the police department, she would not often make it. If he brought it up, she'd get belligerent and stomp away, and it would be 2 days before he could talk with her again. One day when Rosie was particularly late, Dr. Mills called her at home. One of her kids picked up the phone. "Where's your mom?" Doc asked. "She's asleep. Go get her." An hour or two later, Rosie arrived, grumpy and bent out of shape that Mills had dragged her out of her house. On other occasions, she would get defensive or give an excuse. "Well, my kid was sick," or "I don't feel good." One time she woke up and called in saying that she had to get her food stamps at the food stamp office and wouldn't be in until 1 o'clock. Then she went back to sleep. 2 hours later, her kid strolled into the store. Pam said innocently, "Your mom's down at the food stamp office?" "No, she's home asleep." For Roger, it was a continual struggle. As her supervisor, he felt he needed to confront her a number of times. He tried to work out a reasonable arrangement with her. Rosie would make an effort for a while, then slip back into old habits, and Doc would have to confront her again. On 3 or 4 occasions, he threatened to write her up, telling her that people downtown, to whom he was responsible, told him that if she wasn't coming to work on time, he'd have to put her through a disciplinary process, complete with hearings, and they'd maybe have to suspend her. Roger said he didn't want that, but that's what he would have to do if she didn't get her act together. Then she'd come around for a while, then gradually show up later and later. Dr. Mills found himself in a delicate and tricky situation. He wanted to help everyone gain a new outlook, Rosie included. She had the same kinds of personal problems as others in Modello. But he was also her boss. The arrangement wasn't working. Roger proved he too could get caught up in this thinking like everyone else. He sought Pam's counsel because Pam and Rosie had become very close. Rosie trusted Pam and would listen to her. "Look, is it worth it?" Roger asked Pam. "I'm having such a hard time with this. Should we fire her and hire somebody else?" Pam did not want Rosie fired. She suggested that Roger just be Rosie's boss and find somebody else to counsel her. In his heart, Roger knew firing Rosie would be most inadvisable. She knew everyone. She knew their family situations and their histories. She gave the effort clout. If Rosie told the residents to come to an important meeting, they often did. No one else would be able to get the residents out like she could, especially to come with an open mind and hear that there was something here that made sense. Mills needed her. He was therefore willing to put up with a lot. He also knew she needed the job, but it was a continuous struggle. Struggles seemed to follow Rosie. In the beginning, like many of the other residents, she often got into trouble. Because she was one of the leaders, Rosie believed she should be able to park her car on the grass right next to her apartment. This violated HUD rules. They towed it away. Rosie stormed into the office. "Who do they think they are, towing my car away?" Doc looked up from the desk with a smile. "Well, gee, Rosie, you know you're supposed to park it in the lot. Give me a break." Everyone laughed and teased her about it. Roger's phone rang late one night. Groggy, he picked up the phone. "Doc, this is Rosie. I'm in jail." She claimed to have been speeding out to get to Sam McKinnon's father's funeral, driving with a recently suspended license, and she got nabbed. "Can you bail me out?" "Gee, I don't know, Rosie. You drive around with a suspended license, and then when the officer stops you, you call him an SOB? What do you think he's going to do?" "No, I don't think I'm going to bail you out." Roger laughed about it, but he didn't want to be in the position of having to save the residents all the time. He did want to be there to give emotional and psychological support and show that he and his staff were on their side and would do whatever they could. "Okay, look," Doc said, "I'll call the state attorney's office and see if they can do something, but they may not be able to." They couldn't, so Rosie spent the night in jail. She declared she'd never go back to jail again. One time, Rosie got into an argument with one of her neighbors. Her neighbor came after her with a gun and shot at her. Someone called the police. Dr. Mills said to Rosie, "Look, if you're working for us, you can't get into these kinds of things. You're supposed to be a role model." One day, Lamar hurried into the store with a man close on his heels, desperately cracked out, wanting Lamar to sell him something on the spot. Embarrassed, Lamar glanced sheepishly at Pam. "Get out," Lamar told the man. Pam said, "Go ahead, deal with your problem." Before long, Lamar came back in. "How long have you known?" "Known what?" asked Pam. "You know what I mean. How long have you known what I do here?" "I've always known what you do." "Well, why didn't you ever say anything?" "Because that's not what I'm here for. I'm not here to say anything. Anytime you want to talk about it, we can talk about it, but I'm not here to stop you." Lamar was shocked that she had known all along, especially given her purpose for being there, and hadn't rejected him outright. She hadn't said, "You're the kind of person that's wrong with this neighborhood, and that's what I'm here to fight." She hadn't said, "You're a bad person, and I don't want to have anything to do with you." An enormous barrier cracked. Lamar began coming in, saying, "You know, I'm clean." "I don't think you use." "Because I don't. I never use drugs." "Oh, that's fine," Pam said matter-of-factly. "Well, I get high. I smoke every once in a while." "It's okay. We all have our things that we've done." After beating around the bush a while, Lamar asked her, "What do you think of what I do?" "I separate you from what you do. I like you as a person. I consider that we've developed a friendship." "Do I like what you do?" "No. I don't like the impact it has. I don't like what it does to the people that buy it. I don't like what it does to their children. And I know you like these kids. I've seen you with these kids, and you're terrific with them. You buy these kids food. You do all kinds of things. But nobody would have to buy them as much food if your product wasn't on the streets. I don't like what you do. Would I like to see you stop? Of course I would. Would I like to see you do something legitimate? Yes. Can I help you do something legitimate? Yes. But those are all decisions you have to make." Lamar became quiet. No words came. Then he said, "Okay, I think I'm going to go now. See you later." By spring, parenting class regulars were actually beginning to enjoy coming to class. Not for the content, which they rarely paid attention to, but because it was fun. When a birthday came around, they celebrated it. They began to have a good time. Pam. The parenting class started out very informally as a very comfortable, warm place to come. Roger was wonderful in those things. The women would come in and bring their babies, and he'd be sitting there with babies crawling all over him. It allowed a relationship to form that was not based on teaching. It was just a good, strong relationship, and that's exactly what it should have been. If you had invited these ladies to come in to learn something, they were like, "I've got to cook lunch." But you can have this understanding on your own, and you're going to have an impact on people around you. There was no judgment going on. Some people came in filthy. Their children could be filthy. Some came in spotless. There was just a whole range of stuff. But no matter what, everybody was just happy that you came. Patty. It took maybe a month for us to start listening. We started out giving Doc a hard time, trying to give him a hard time. Not really a hard time. We always did everything with fun. We never got where it was serious all the time. We joked about everything, even when we were giving him a hard time. We didn't really know where Doc was coming from. And a month passed and this guy was still here, and we figured he must be serious about trying to get this project going. Thelma. We took Dr. Mills through some changes. We told him that he's crazy. Oh, we told him some of everything in the class. And he wouldn't do nothing but sit there and laugh at us. All of us took him through some changes. It struck them particularly funny when Dr. Mills started talking about their moods. Thelma. When he come up with high moods and low moods, somebody is going to come off on him, whether it be me or whether it be one of the other ladies. We said, "Are you crazy, talking about a high mood and a low mood? We don't think you know your own moods." Yeah, we did that to Dr. Mills a couple of times. Rosie told him, "I don't want to hear nothing about no high moods and low moods. Do you know how your high moods and low moods is at?" Rosie kept knocking on Cicely's door, trying to pull her out to the parenting class. Cicely didn't want to. Rosie persisted as only Rosie could. Finally, she gave in. "Okay, I'll be over there to the meetings. Sounds okay." Cicely sat in the back of the parenting class and almost never said a word. If asked a direct question, she would look at the floor and mumble softly. Dr. Mills could neither hear nor understand her. While most of the ladies gave Doc a hard time and yelled about their terrible conditions, Cicely never said a word. He assumed she would be one of the hardest to reach. Rumor had it that Cicely's sons were dealing drugs out of her apartment. Her daughters were prostituting themselves for crack. A number of people tipped off Dr. Mills that Cicely's two sons were probably the biggest drug dealers in Modello. And if he went over there and saw their stash of automatic weapons and drugs, he probably wouldn't be alive 10 minutes to talk about it. Cicely. I tell you, I've been through a lot. It was real rough there for a while. I wasn't taking care of my family like I was supposed to, and I wasn't really doing anything with my life. I was just sitting home, just watching TV every day, soap operas, and having babies, 7 children and 11 grandchildren. 24 hours around the clock and laying around. I wasn't doing anything positive in my life at that time. I wasn't going to church then. At the time, I wasn't interested in anything. My sons were hanging out with the wrong crew, dealing drugs, and the other guys were stealing. My daughter was on crack, and she was out there on the streets at 14 or 15 years old. And I tell you, she got so bad there on drugs that all her hair came out. She was as bald-headed as my hand, and her weight went down to nothing. She was weighing about 125 to 130 pounds, and she went down to 80 or 90 pounds. That's how little she was. That's the way my life was at that time. Utterly overwhelmed by it all, Cicely felt too embarrassed about what was going on in her family to say anything. It seemed as if she couldn't say anything because somebody might jump down her throat and say, "Well, you think you're so good. Why can't you keep your kids from dealing drugs and your daughter from prostitution?" So she barely said a word. In the class, no one knew whether Cicely was listening. No one knew whether anything was getting through. Lisa. Cicely and I both moved into Modello in 1972, and for 18 years, I didn't know who Cicely was, until the parenting class. We were just like in a little island. No one knew what was going on. We didn't realize that it was our problem. What was their problem was our problem. We all had similar problems. Cicely. I was quiet. I didn't have nothing to say, but I was really taking it in at the time, and I enjoyed it, that class. It really helped me a lot. It really did, about how to deal with people with an attitude. It really helped me out a lot. It got me to come out. I care for the people. I felt the love we had for each other. From celebrating people's birthdays, they all started to go on picnics together. The only purpose was to have a good time, residents and staff alike. They all had a great time. The atmosphere spilled over into the office. It became a fun, pleasant place to be. The other service providers felt the change. By late spring, Pam began to see dramatic changes in how the agencies related to one another. Pam. So the agencies began to settle in and become friendly, and they started to see that Roger's stuff brought results that none of them had before. Meanwhile, Marilyn, the parenting consultant, began to help Roger and the ladies from the parenting class put together a little cartoon-like book on parenting with Miami-Dade Community College. But while she went through the same training with Lloyd and Pam, she was having a difficult time understanding what they were so excited about. Soon, she left the project. In the parenting class one day, Lisa heard Dr. Mills say that no child was bad. Kids were just afraid sometimes, or insecure and acting it out the only way they knew how. Lisa thought about her son, now in second grade. She'd been having some trouble with him. He'd become somewhat overactive at school. No doubt it had something to do with what was happening at home. After class, as they headed to the store for a soda, Lisa pulled Dr. Mills aside and shared her problem. Her son had gotten into a fight at school and ended up in the principal's office. They called Lisa and told her to come in. Lisa had responded defensively. "Would you like me to go with you?" Dr. Mills asked. His offer surprised her. She didn't know what to make of it. "Okay," she said suspiciously. Together they walked to the school for the meeting. Along the way, Dr. Mills said, "You know, Lisa, kids are going to be kids. I know you're upset now, but what you need to do right now is to calm down, because you can see things more clearly without going in there like da-da-da-da-da-da, placing blame and being so angry at your child for what he did that you're not listening. You want to go in there in a frame of mind where you can explain to them what you want. Something like, 'I'm not condoning my child's behavior, but maybe we could work something out instead of suspension,' or whatever." With Dr. Mills at the meeting, Lisa found herself able to listen and understand what the principal and teacher were saying without getting upset and placing blame. Doc's presence truly helped. If he hadn't said what he'd said beforehand, she'd have gone in teed off and blasting, yelling, "I don't care," and blah, 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 blah. And it wouldn't have done her child any good. She would have showed the school that she wasn't the type of parent they could trust to go to. After that meeting, Lisa began to develop a good relationship with the principal and school. At times, her child was a total character. But when the teachers and principal learned that she really cared about her child and did her best, they let a lot of things pass that her son could have been in trouble for. Lisa offered to the principal, "Dr. Whitty, do what you need to do with him." Dr. Whitty would call Lisa and say, "Lots of times your son thinks he's in more trouble than he is. I don't want to mess up anything on his record. Listen, we need more parents like you." Lisa began to think, maybe some of these things Dr. Mills is talking are true. Although they didn't bring up many problems with their kids within the class, many of the parents began to pull him aside afterwards. Doc witnessed Rosie letting the thought creep in that there just might be something to all this. Something seemed to click in her personal life. Rosie would go into the food stamp office, be given a hard time by the woman behind the desk, and essentially be treated like dirt. In response, Rosie would tell the woman where she could stick her food stamps and stomp home feeling very self-righteous. Afterwards, she realized she didn't have any food on the table, nor food stamps to buy it. She'd cut off her nose to spite her face. Doc said, "Rosie, look, if I yelled at you and put you down, would you listen to me after that? Or would you just get more defensive and argue back? Look, what happens with you and your boyfriend even, or you and your kids? When you yell at them, do they calm down and listen? Do they pay attention to you and do what you want? No, they get defensive or they yell back, or they sulk or they argue with you, and they just get their backs up more. Look at this in a common sense way." In class, Rosie brought this up. She could now see how it was self-defeating. She could now see that the food stamp worker probably just had a rough day and faced a lot of belligerent clients who hadn't done their paperwork and wanted their food stamps anyway. So when Rosie's turn came, the worker started to give her a hard time. Maybe the welfare worker had a fight with her husband the night before, or maybe she was sick of her job and didn't think she could do any better. "So she's going to take it out on me," concluded Rosie. "And I don't have to take it personally. Instead, I could say, 'You must be having a rough day. What can I do? Just let me get my paperwork done and get out of your hair.'" Rosie began to discover that when she was nicer to people, it calmed them down. When she saw them as human beings in their separate realities and treated them that way, they responded. She got what she wanted more without the upset and turmoil. Even when she had thoughts of wanting to kill Dr. Mills, she began to realize it was just her mood, and she didn't need to act on it. She learned how to settle down, to calm herself, and wait until those thoughts dissipated. Yet Rosie was still being beaten a lot by her boyfriend. Rosie. I was in an abusive relationship, very abusive. Before I got involved with this approach, I didn't have any self-esteem. I was just at home having babies. The world outside didn't matter. Doc wanted to try to help Rosie and others see that what they thought was normal really wasn't. It was just how they had learned to think and what they had come to accept. Chapter 7. Spring, 1988. Rogers Grant proposed to reduce student discipline referrals. This could only happen if the teachers knew how to deal constructively with these kids. So Dr. Mills offered a 25-hour teacher training course at the Homestead Middle School. The course would be voluntary. To mandate it would spell disaster. Teachers would resent being forced to attend, and during the training would display every behavior they would never let their own students get away with. They would grumble, work on their lesson plans, or read the newspaper. Maria Garcia. A lot of us are trying to do the best we can in the classroom, and we kind of feel resentful towards people who think they can come in and do it better. Here's this guy who wears a three-piece suit in his ivory tower. The teacher training began in February. Over the first year, about 1/4 of the faculty attended one of 3 courses. They met in the library after school for 2 hours once a week. Roger tried to make the atmosphere relaxed and easygoing, offering coffee and donuts to help the teachers unwind. Maria Garcia. The child who has been here every day, who you think has been listening, out of the 10 little questions he misses 6, and you think, why is that happening? Why does he have so many things in his head that he can't sit and enjoy being a kid? Or that little girl in the 6th grade, 12 years old, who comes in all full of hickeys. Doesn't her mother see that? Why should I have to worry about that? Which I do. A lot of us in education, we're here because we want to be here. I know it's not the greatest paying job in the world, but I want to make a difference. But it is kind of sad for me to think I've made a difference if I reach one child in 30 years of teaching. I should want to be able to say a whole lot more than that. Dr. Mills. The basic idea behind the teacher training was to get the teachers to see these kids differently. Their beliefs about these kids were a large part of the problem. Many were saying, I hope I don't get any Modello kids in my class. They had these kids stereotyped. As soon as a Modello kid got in their class, the kid had 3 strikes against him. The kid didn't have a chance because the teacher didn't really give him a chance. So the teacher's attitudes and expectations kept them seeing the Modello kids in a way that inadvertently kept the kids locked into a negative frame of mind about themselves and school. So much of the teacher training was aimed at helping the teachers see them as basically healthy kids who had just developed an alienated perspective. We tried to get the teachers to see that the child is basically innocent, that the kids basically want to learn, want to do well in school, want to cooperate. We talked to the teachers about their state of mind, how stressed out they were, how they saw these kids, how much they enjoyed teaching, how much of their excitement about the subject they passed along to the kids. We had to talk about all these things that they could relate to, about common sense and maturity in their own lives, their self-esteem, because you can't teach something you don't know. If you're not a happy person and you're not satisfied with your work, how can you pass along a good attitude about learning to your students? Dr. Mills began the training by saying, every child is born with a natural propensity to use common sense. It's inborn. Kids don't start out predisposed towards deviance or self-destructive behavior. They start out predisposed to function with common sense, to know what's in their best interests. They start out with a kind of a natural enjoyment of learning. with positive motivation that doesn't have proving or stress associated with it. It's always amazed me how much little children are natural learners and how learning becomes aversive when they get into the formal educational system. Somehow that natural desire to learn gets shut off like a faucet. It's shut off because we, as educators, take learning so seriously. We think it's hard. We think grades are important. We create competition. We create stress, keeping the school's standardized test scores up. So our stress and insecurity is passed along to the kids. And guess what? They lose that natural interest in learning. It becomes aversive rather than fun. Also, a lot of these kids' parents have not gone to school. They've given up on school, so they're going to pass that on to their children, not consciously, not purposely, but because that's what they see possible for themselves. So what we want to try to do is see how to re-engage these students in learning. Every child wants to do the best at whatever they take on, and if they're enjoying it, they will do their best without any pressure or stress or performance anxiety. Kids start out with unconditional self-esteem. Have you ever seen a 2-year-old or 3-year-old whose self-esteem is conditional on how expensive their clothes are or what color their skin is? They just enjoy life. They're not self-conscious. See, that's all stuff we learn from our upbringing, isn't it? So what happens is the child learns a set of beliefs. They develop a way of thinking because their parents say, you can't feel good about yourself unless blank. All of a sudden, we start to put conditions on their self-esteem or their well-being. You can't feel good about yourself unless you go to school looking nice. We try to impose our standards on our kids because we think it reflects on us. So we try to make their self-esteem conditional in a certain way. Then they develop insecure beliefs. And when they get insecure, they act out or get in trouble or react in a dysfunctional way. We found with most of the kids we've been working with that once they get into the first grade, they have very insecure beliefs. They think that they don't fit in, that adults don't like them, that other kids won't like them, that they can't learn because they're Black, because they come from the projects, because their parents have dropped out, because of all the negativity in the home, because their parents are yelling at them all the time and telling them they're bad or stupid. So that becomes their way of thinking about themselves. Now, what you want to keep in mind is that they never lose their innate mental health. It's impossible. It just gets covered up or pushed underneath the surface. But it's still there and still has a natural tendency to come back to the surface like a cork being held underwater. So as soon as you take whatever insecure thoughts that are keeping it down out of the way, it will pop back up on its own. It naturally reemerges. As soon as you start to show a kid that these negative beliefs are just thoughts, not reality, this comes back almost immediately. If they find any teacher or counselor who starts to treat them as if they're okay, treats them with love and respect, and listens to them, treats them as if they're a whole person or a healthier person, that health comes right back to the surface. But when the child enters school with this insecure way of seeing things, if another kid gets angry at him or pushes him, or if a teacher looks at him cross-eyed, if he's insecure, he'll react. He'll get in trouble, and that will give him further evidence that he doesn't fit in, that others don't like him, that teachers are against him or her. It just reinforces his view. If we have an insecure way of thinking, we interpret what's going on as evidence. That teacher really is against me. The other kids really don't like me. And what's his emotional response going to be? He's going to get angry or feel hurt or feel sorry for himself or withdraw or talk back to the teacher. So the negative emotion will create a negative behavior. And the negative behavior will cause a certain kind of response from the teachers. Send him to the principal or give him an F or detention. So the response will reinforce the thinking that they are against him, that he can't make it in school, that he's not going to do okay. Do you see how it becomes self-confirming, downward spiral of increasing alienation? So most of these kids don't expect to finish high school. They don't think it's the place for them. But it's just a cycle of thought that a child picks up. And you can break this at any point. If an adult really believes in you and likes you and connects with you and engages your healthier levels and really inspires you to do better than you thought you could, you can get through to these kids at any moment. You can turn these kids around. If you build a good rapport with these students, the quality of your relationship will make their thinking relax, and it will bring out the best in them. You can't give a child self-esteem. He or she already has it. All you have to do is engage them in a way that it starts to come out of them. Most of the teachers had never looked at it that way before. Many more parents showed up at PTA meetings when the topic centered around problems with the school or when an issue hit home. Rosie would knock on their doors, tell them about the issue, and ask them to come out and talk about what to do. At first, the residents had been quite wary, but with Rosie, Pam, Doc, and Lloyd all asking, "What would you like to see changed in your community?" Instead of telling them what to do, the residents began to come up with ideas. Whatever it is you want to say, there will be time for you to say it. It's not just for us 5, it's for everybody. Just come in, put your opinion in, and let's get this thing going. The parents would trickle in and see, hey, my opinion did count. They would sit around in a circle, bring up issues, offer opinions, and make decisions. At least one of the staff would sit in with them. To start the meetings, they would ask, how are you doing? What's happening with you? How can we help you make your community better? The staff then stayed in the background while the parents ran the group. They would never tell residents what issues to concentrate on or how to make decisions. Doc kept saying to staff, you've got to trust residents' wisdom to know the best thing to do. The parents appreciated it. Any idea was considered okay, and as Lisa said, there were some doozies. The staff were there to help if needed. When the meetings bogged down, they might ask, is there anything we can help you with about getting your kids to go to school on a regular basis? How do you feel about school? How do you feel about the teachers and administrators? How can you bridge the gaps between you and the administrators? What would you do to make the school better? What do you see happening in the community with your kids? They started to talk about how to resolve the truancy problem, how they could eliminate the drug dealing, how they could get maintenance to be more responsive. The PTA became the focal point to take on all community issues. When he was around, Dr. Mills wanted to use these meetings as opportunities to teach about thought. He wanted the residents to understand that the people who were giving them problems were also doing the best they knew how. HUD workers and welfare workers were human beings who just needed some guidance and help in doing their jobs better. Even the police, school teachers, and principals were innocent and doing their best. When you approach these people, Doc would say, you don't want to go in there with an attitude or yelling at them and putting them down and making them feel like the scum of the earth because you don't want people to do it to you. The parents certainly had bones to pick with the teachers and school administrators, and the school could not get the parents to come in and meet about their kids. Many were dropouts themselves, intimidated, afraid to respond when a teacher called them. Nearly everyone wanted to string up a particular elementary school teacher whom they thought racist. She was always on their kids' cases, calling them little black monkeys. The principal didn't respond. He was an ex-military man who was hard on the kids and gave parents a hard time. The barrier between school and parents had to be broken. Look, said Doc, they're just conditioned to think a certain way. They don't know any better right now. They're overwhelmed with all these so-called high-risk students in the school. The school has a bad reputation. The principal is trying to save his ass and be the tough guy. Keep that in mind. Invite the principal over to a PTA meeting. Tell him what you want to do and ask for his help. Don't go in there and lay the man out. The PTA decided to ask the principal to come and meet with them. They had a productive discussion. The residents began to see different ways they dealt with people brought different results. Which produced results, to go storming in a rage or to approach people the way Dr. Mills talked about. Once they looked at it, it was common sense. As the middle school teacher training progressed, Dr. Mills said state of mind was the most important variable in behavior. A child acting out in the classroom is not going out of his way to be a bad child. He is just being insecure in the moment. Some teachers began to stop taking the kids' behavior personally. They began to see the kids with more understanding and compassion. They came to understand these were basically good kids, and that every child is capable of learning, of having positive motivation, of coming up with their own answers. They learned if a student was having trouble, she or he could be helped to calm down, to see things differently, and to use more common sense. The teachers could calm down too. The teachers raised questions about discipline. Many believed they had to be pretty heavy-handed about punishments or consequences to teach the kids to behave. Dr. Mills responded, "But you put the same kids in detention or suspend them over and over again, and it doesn't seem to help." Another way to look at it is you could establish a relationship with each child, understand more what's going on in their homes, see what's causing them to swear in class or talk back. Understand what the child's insecurities are. You could make them feel more comfortable and be more accepting of them, so it will be easier for them to settle down for you. Try to be more patient, more present with each student, and see each one differently. Just get to know them as people. Every day when every child comes to school, see them as healthy. See each as a child able to learn, rather than, "Oh no, here comes so-and-so. Another day with that kid who's going to give me a hard time." This is no panacea, Dr. Mills cautioned. It's no overnight remedy. Sometimes, no matter how positive you try to be, no matter how much you try to change the other person's outlook, it's still going to be a very long and gradual process. They may never see things that way, so all you can really do is see it for yourself. Teacher training evaluations showed the teachers were helped by seeing that their biggest problem in the classroom was their own state of mind. Dr. Mills began to see a subtle change in Cicely. Slowly, she would say something in the parenting class. Gradually, she began to contribute. Her eyes would look up a bit from the floor. Her voice became a little more clear. She became a little more involved in the happenings of the PTA. "You know, you can help your children," Dr. Mills said to Cicely one day when he felt the time was right. "You've got it in you. You can see what's going on with them a little differently, and you can guide them." Cicely was ready to listen but had no idea what to do. "You could just show them more love and attention," Dr. Mills offered. "You could do things with them. You could talk to them in a more common sense way and help them see that they're on a dead-end road. You could help them see that they could do more in their lives than just deal drugs on the corner." It took a while, but it began to make sense. Cicely had been taking everything they did personally. She took it all as a reflection on her. Dr. Mills told her it wasn't. Her kids weren't doing these things to her. They themselves were hurting, and they didn't know what else to do. Cicely slowly began to see that if she had self-esteem inside her, if it was naturally there in everyone, like Dr. Mills kept saying, then she could feel good about herself. She could be happy in her life. "I'm going to start feeling good about myself," Cicely informed herself one day. Rosie managed to bring a new participant to the parenting class. She cared about Thelma very much. Thelma stayed drunk nearly all the time. Everyone knew it. Everyone talked about it. When she went on a drinking binge with the father of her youngest children, a man in worse shape than she, he would beat her unmercifully. Their frequent fights would begin in the apartment and often end up in the middle of the courtyard for everyone to see. Thelma's eyes were continually swollen and painted, and her lips busted up from the beatings. Thelma's boyfriend was also apparently sexually abusing one of her daughters. Again, everyone knew. There were no secrets in Modello. Thelma. Before Dr. Mills came around, I was like this. I didn't go nowhere. I stayed home. I kept my house clean, stayed pregnant. I had a lot of pressure on me. I was a mother with 9 children. My daughter, she was expecting. My oldest daughter, she was sick. And it was like I didn't have anybody to reach out to me. And my boyfriend, my kid's father, he was beating me up. And I was drinking a lot. I wouldn't have anything to do with none of my neighbors. I wouldn't even go to their house to use the telephone. And with my kids, as long as they handed me $5 or $10 to get me a bottle, if I just had my bottle, everything would have been cool to me. And when I go to get my lips to that bottle, I wouldn't get no half pint. I had to get me one of those liters. As long as I had my liter of liquor, I was all right. Thelma was too drunk to care to do anything with her children. Rosie hated to see Thelma like this. Rosie had been trying to conquer her own battering problems, nothing compared to this, and felt she had to do something. She wanted to get Thelma to the parenting class. Thelma had met Dr. Mills briefly and heard him say some things about low moods and high moods and psychology, and her reaction was no different than the other women. "This man is crazier than I am," she said. "This man, he don't know what he's talking about." She certainly did not want to go to any parenting class, but it was Rosie asking her to come. "Okay, I'll be there." Thelma attended her first meeting. To her surprise, she liked it. She went to her second meeting and liked that too. At her third meeting, Thelma walked in 45 minutes late. Her face tore up, black eyes, hair in disarray, no shoes, feet caked with mud, clothes dirty, not smelling any too good, and looking like she'd just been through hell. No one raised an eyebrow. Doc just seemed glad to see her. He always did, no matter how anyone looked, even barefoot and bruised and with torn, dirty dresses. Everyone in the class responded in kind. No judgment. Nobody shifted in their chairs in discomfort. Doc only talked possibilities. He paid no attention to what might be wrong. He wanted only to give everyone a nice feeling about themselves. He accepted Thelma in whatever way she appeared, no matter how she looked or acted, no matter what she had been through. "Hi, Thelma. How are you doing? I'm glad to see you. Come sit down. How are you feeling today?" To hear Thelma tell it, this incident was a test. Others weren't so sure. Thelma: "I say, I'm going to try him a third time, but I'm going to go in there and I'm going to be myself. And I go in there and it had been raining and I was barefoot and had mud all over my feet. I say, I'm going to try this man. He claims he's all this and he's all that. And I'll go in there barefooted, mud all over my feet to see how he's going to accept me then, right? I went up there, barefooted and all that, mud between my toes and stuff, and I stepped in there, and Dr. Mills looked at me and smiled, with this great big old smile on his face, like he was not paying my feet any attention, you know? He just started talking to me. He was just asking me how I was doing, and he was glad to see me. He was greeting me, you know? And I'm standing there looking at this man saying, "This man ain't paying no attention to my feet, and look how black they are." And he was talking to me like a man should talk to a lady, right? And that made me feel bad. I mean, I made my own self feel bad by me coming in there like this, right? And I'm coming in like this just to see how he's going to accept me. I'm testing him. Let me tell you, I really felt bad. I didn't stay there. I left. I told him I'd be back. I went home, got in the tub, took me a good bath, and I came back. Then I stepped back in there. Thelma was shocked the class didn't reject her for the way she looked, for the way she was. Not only Dr. Mills, but everyone in that parenting group. It proved a breakthrough in the way she saw herself. Thelma. It looked to me like they saw good in me, you know? Thelma began to feel better about herself. Her eyes opened wide. 3 months into the class and PTA, they developed such rapport there was almost no distinction between staff and residents. Lloyd was just Lloyd, not Lloyd Fields, social worker. Dr. Mills was just Doc. At those times, the residents instinctively knew no one was trying to sell them a bill of goods. Lisa. They were just like one of us. They ate the same things we ate. If we were having cornbread and beans, they ate cornbread and beans. There wasn't any funny stuff or anything like that. And when we were going somewhere with these really educated people, it wasn't like, I don't want them going this place because they're not quite as educated. No, we went. And there were some characters that went with us, but we accepted each other. We went to their house and said, "Hey, how are you doing?" And we'd know what was going on with their lives. They'd introduce us to their families, and we introduced them to ours. They weren't like workers. It was like they were just friends. On their outings, Lloyd watched with great interest. He considered these times an extension of their group sessions, where the ladies were living the feeling the staff wanted to create. No talking needed. Still, he waited for moments to interject some pertinent nuggets. One time, in the midst of eating, fooling around, talking freely, Lloyd saw Thelma so happy, talking her head off, something she rarely did. She brought up her son Tyrone, with whom she had been having problems. Lloyd asked, "What do you think you could do to help your son Tyrone?" "You know something?" It dawned on her. "I could go to school and talk with the teacher. And talk with Tyrone when he comes home. Just ask him how school was. I could put my arm around Tyrone and tell him I love him." Before that moment, it had never occurred to her to ask, "How's school?" or even show him much affection. "Oh, okay," said Lloyd. Then he went back to their fun conversation. One day on a picnic to the beach with the kids, where everyone had a good time, Thelma confided to Doc, "There's something different about this program. Nobody's telling us what's wrong with us, or what we need to fix about ourselves or our kids." Doc smiled. It was fun, yes, feeling like a family, but Roger knew they were learning more than they realized. In casual conversation, when feelings were high, was when they were most open. Those were the times to interject something germane, to casually ask how they might look at various situations in a more common-sense way. If a resident was having trouble with her social worker trying to take away her kids because she wasn't going in for her urine analysis, Doc would say, "Look, this social worker has nothing else to go on other than you not showing up for your drug tests or appointments. So because you're pissed at her for threatening to take away your kids, you're making it more likely that she'll do that. It's common sense when you stop and think about it." They talked often about common sense. Doc insisted that everyone has it. It could help them. But when people are upset or angry or down or caught up in things, they don't have access to it. Nobody does. The ladies became fascinated with this idea. In May, to celebrate the one-year anniversary of the opening of the Modello store and to have a family celebration day, they decided to hold a momentous community event, complete with barbecue, carnival rides, clowns, and a DJ on stage set up on the basketball court. About 400 people came out, including parents, kids, friends from other projects, neighbors, relatives. Sergeant Carl Bask from the Metro-Dade Police Department, who had begun to take great interest in Modello and visit fairly often, showed up with a couple of other officers. Everyone had a wonderful time. They laughed and danced and sang and kidded around and played a little basketball at the other end of the court. Just before the event, one of the prime drug dealers approached Pam and said, "You know, Pam, I really have a lot of respect for what you're trying to do here. So, out of respect to you, we're not going to sell drugs here today." Pam. I was thrilled. The next day, they went back to selling, of course, but that day, out of respect, they didn't sell. I was very touched by that. I really felt as though I had made some inroads. I consider it one of my biggest successes. No blame. This thought made Lisa first begin to listen. Initially, she'd thought, parenting class. He's going to tell us how to raise our kids and everything we're doing is going to be wrong. Instead, Dr. Mills said, everyone is doing the best they can at the time, given how they see things, so there's no blame to place on anyone, whatever your situation is. I'm not here trying to tell you how to raise your children. I'm just offering you alternatives. The parents would bring up some of the bad things their kids would do. "No child is really bad," said Dr. Mills. "You haven't seen some of our kids." Another chimed in, "I don't care what you say. Maybe hers isn't bad, and maybe hers isn't bad, but mine is bad." They just have their own way of seeing things, Doc said. He knew the parents would have to see it for themselves. Lisa. He was just wanting us to work on ourselves. He just had to help us see how to do it. Patty. Through having our class, I realized I had to pick it up, that I was trying to get myself together, and I started having a little more patience, trying to get settled in that neighborhood. Doc put a lot of light on things, and I really didn't understand at first. Doc and Lloyd never stopped trying to think up creative ways to help them see their situation in a different light. The message was basically the same, but each resident somehow had to see it for herself. That was the trick. They didn't always see the connection. After someone in class brought up a distressing incident concerning her child, Doc said, "If you feel like killing your child when you're really upset with him, just notice that's how you're feeling. Then, once you notice it, put a lid on it. Don't do it, and walk around the block, or go to a neighbor's, or watch TV, or send them to their room, or lie down on the couch with pillows over your head. Do whatever you need to do to try to calm down and get in a nicer frame of mind. Try to get a nice feeling back for your child first before dealing with him. Wait until your mood shifts. When you think about your child, think about his innocence, or think about him in a more loving way, or a more accepting way. Then go talk to him and listen to him and see that your child has his own reality, his own way of looking at things, and know that he has common sense too." Doc would say, notice your moods. Notice how you are with your children at the times you're really feeling good and at ease, and how you behave toward them when they're really upset about something and the results of that. Doc would ask, do you notice how you see things differently when you're in a really bad mood? Things look awful and your kids look like monsters. And this place looks like the hell end of the world. But when you're in a good mood, then you have a nice day and enjoy your kids and enjoy your neighbors. Your moods and your thinking are connected. The parents seemed to resonate. They could see when they were in a bad mood and having a rotten day, and then their kid annoyed them. It was the straw that broke the camel's back. They'd take it out on their kids and scream or knock them across the room. If the parent simply noticed the mood she was in, was just aware of it, then she had access to the option to stop taking it out on her children so much. Plus, she wouldn't have to suffer so much herself because she would come out of it faster. The parents noticed when they were in a good mood, they saw their children in nicer ways. Noticing it gave them more volition about it. Doc and Lloyd continuously brought this to their attention. When you're in a bad mood, your kids look like brats and you yell at them. Then they get in a bad mood and yell back. Do you see that dynamic? When you're in a good mood, do you notice that you're more loving and interested in your children? And they seem more calm and cooperative. All this talk about moods was beginning to make some sense. They began to say to themselves, I could either knock my kid across the room or go out and walk around the block, or talk to my neighbor for a while until I calm down. Then I can come back and talk to my child in a calmer way and get better results. Sometimes Lloyd would ask, what do you do to discipline your kids? Well, I beat my kids. I wear his ass out. I don't do anything. I just tell him that he shouldn't do it. And I just keep telling him, and it doesn't do any good. I have to stay on my children's case all the time because my kids are bad. This one is smart, but this other one acts like a joke. In response, Lloyd would say, did you ever notice that if you always tell your kid he's crazy, he acts crazy? If you tell him he's smart, then he's going to try to act smart. The staff only wanted to help them see things in a different way. They would then see for themselves whether it worked. Some parents disagreed with their view. Lloyd said, if what we said bothers you, that's okay. Don't think about it. Just enjoy yourself while you're here. Doc wanted the class to be an oasis where the parents would gather and feel comfortable. If they felt relaxed and lighthearted, they would let down their guards and maybe some learning would get through. It appeared to be working. Dr. Mills. We said, you already know how to be a good parent. It's just a matter of getting yourself in that state of mind where your common sense will help you see what your child needs at any moment. There's really no parenting technique that can help you. You just have to watch your own moods. When you're in a low mood, that's the wrong time to interact with your child. Just wait until your mood changes and listen to your child, and you'll see how they're seeing things and how they're caught up in their own separate reality, their own separate way of seeing things, and then you'll be able to help them. The point of discipline is really to help the kids regain their perspective or regain their own capacity for common sense, as opposed to punishment for punishment's sake. Lloyd. It was just sitting on the wave and letting the wave carry us, and we'd just flow with the wave. If it goes the way of talking about kids, then we'd probably spend 2 weeks talking about our kids. It may flow to police involvement and then might flow right back. But whichever way it flowed, our main objective was to get them to understand how thought works, what moods are and how they operate in them, what to look for and what not to look for, what to trust and what not to trust. One day, Carrie Mae's son brought a knife to his 5th grade class and cut one of the other kids. Carrie Mae had a volatile temper. She would go off on her neighbors or on her own kids whenever it struck. If a teacher did something to her that she didn't like, she would storm down to school. If the school ever called her about her child doing something bad, she was known to stomp down the street to the school, take down his pants, and whip him with a belt right in front of the principal. So when she received this phone call from the school, she became livid. Quickly, she grabbed her belt. She roared down the street to the school, ready to do some damage. Halfway there, something clicked. Into her head popped something she heard in the parenting class. Don't interact with your child in a low mood. Take a break first. Calm down. Let off some steam. Uh-oh, she said to herself. You're in a bad mood right now. You'd better watch it. Carrie Mae's pace slowed. When she reached the school, she picked up her child without saying a word. She brought him home, told him to go to his room, walked over to a neighbor's apartment, and stayed there for 3 hours until she found that warm, loving feeling for him return. Then she went to him. She brought up the situation at the next parenting class. It took me 3 hours to calm down enough to feel like I could talk to him right. I came home and told my son to come out. He was ready to get beaten up because that's what he was used to. I said, no, I'm not going to hit you. I just want to find out what you could have been thinking, why it made sense for you to do that. I want to understand. Are you having problems at school? And he said the older kids were picking on him, and he didn't know what else to do. He was scared, and this was the only way he could figure to handle it. And I was shocked because I never stopped long enough before to find out what he was going through. And we had the best conversation we ever had in our lives. We both broke down and cried and hugged each other. Then we talked about other ways that he could have handled it, like going to the principal or the teacher or talking to me. It proved a major breakthrough in their relationship. Carrie Mae stopped having problems with her son. Such was the power of understanding moods, of understanding the need to back off, to calm down, to get the feeling, to become reconnected with one's own common sense and wisdom, then respond with a loving feeling. The parents shared such stories, and the rest listened and learned. Many had similar experiences. Modello residents were not happy with the police. When they burst into the project on a raid or sting, they didn't always know who the bad guys were, so anyone who happened to be in their path would either have a gun pointed at them or be told, hey, you better get your butt on the ground. Lloyd. When there were gunshots, a lot of kids used to duck into the Modello store. People would call 911, and the dispatchers at 911 would say that they weren't giving them the right type of information, so they couldn't really respond to whatever problem it was. And when the police did come, they would come in like gangbusters. And anybody in the way would get it. They wouldn't care. Cynthia Stennis, Modello daycare director. The sirens would be blasting, and the kids would be ripping and running, and they could get run over. Because I seen it before, stomping on top of kids and stuff to try to get at one person. Yeah, I was there and I seen it. The parents brought up the problem in the PTA. Lloyd asked, how could the police do a better job? How could they help you? They decided to ask State Attorney Janet Reno to come in and sit down with them. She came with representatives from the police force to talk about how they could be more effective. PTA members said, what are you all doing about guys being on every corner? Whoever comes in here, they run to your car thinking you want drugs or something. The police replied, if you want the drugs out of your neighborhood, you're going to have to help us out. If we're coming in and you know it's a sting, if we say, go into your house, don't sit there and argue with us. Go in the house, because we've got guns blaring and we're looking for these guys. Don't let them come through your apartment. Hey, look, if somebody comes running through our apartment, they've got a gun too, and I'm going to let them run through my apartment. Slowly, they began to understand each other's concerns. A rapport began to develop, at least among some residents, a big switch. The police began to see the residents were willing to look at them differently. Therefore, they could begin to change some of their normal police behavior. Whenever Pam and Lloyd knew of a big problem with a family and knew the police would be coming, they would try to be sure at least one of them was present while it was happening to help ease the situation. They would try to calm people down and connect with their common sense and hear what they had to say, so head-to-head anger wouldn't result in violence. If Pam or Lloyd could even get one side to be a little more calm, the other would often respond in kind. When Pam first started in Modello, many residents would not even speak to each other. They were mortal enemies. You don't cross my area. Don't come into my territory. You don't touch my kids or talk to them. As Roger's philosophy began to slowly pervade the area, gradually Pam began to see those barriers dissolve. Relationships improved. Judgments slowly dissipated. People began to think, we're all here trying to get by. We may make mistakes, but we're all here for the same reasons. Roger felt quite heartened to see these subtle changes. He began to see change in people before they even saw changes in themselves. He saw people soften. Their faces look younger. Their eyes get a twinkle. He'd see it in their step and how they talked. They seemed to enjoy themselves more and look nicer. Doc would go home encouraged and delighted, feeling, it's starting to take. On other days, he left frustrated, thinking, I didn't really get that across. Or, I didn't really address what they were asking. On some days, nobody showed up for a class. On others, the entire community acted as if it was in a lowered state of consciousness and everything seemed set back 2 years. People were arguing, fighting, complaining, threatening to kill each other. The whole place was in an uproar, and they couldn't get anyone to calm down. The police had just done a sweep, marching into someone's apartment, pushing them around. Everybody wanted to string up the police and didn't want to hear anything about calming down or handling it in a better way. On such days, Roger would go home discouraged. This hasn't taken at all. Fuck it, I'm going to quit. This whole thing's a pain in the ass. It's not worth it. It's not going to work. But Roger Mills knew enough about moods to know if he felt discouraged, it was just his mood talking. It was only how he was thinking about it at the moment. Roger needn't take those thoughts seriously. He knew it would pass. A couple of days later, he would go back and find the residents too had gotten over their mood and were in a more rational state of mind. That was simply how it worked. Besides, in Modello, things changed so fast and so often that most of the time it kept him feeling hopeful and wanting to see what would happen next.